application into your mostly like industry player application fit in this area of question. Also, application engineer background of decade. See it? Last year.
Kevin, the share I'm seeing is the GC business we built there.
Have you seen it? Okay.
All those are in some model.
Have you seen the presentation before? I
I
get this stuff.
I don't think so.
Okay, great.
We talked a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Nice, there's fairly sure we're going.
And have you seen the presentation before? Say Alexa.
I've seen the presentation.
Yeah. How many times though? That's where we're going.
4 or 5.
4 or 5. Well, we got a wide range of people. So since people haven't seen it before, we're going to go through it. So just otherwise, so we got 2. Is both chemicals in here? Okay. We may speed up JA just a little bit because that's refinery specific. We'll touch on it, but we won't dwell on it just because it doesn't apply to anybody in the room. So we will talk about it, but we will go quickly. It is about a 3-hour talk. We are, let's see if I got my gummy and my pokey because we are ultra flexible. So if you guys want to stop, talk about something, we are very happy to take questions throughout the presentation. So if you don't hesitate to ask questions, we are happy to do that. And also we can take breaks. We set the schedule, we can take breaks whenever we want. Probably take at least 2 breaks just so everybody can go to the restroom and get more coffee. Get through this. Okay. So let me make sure it's covered. Okay, so we're going to go, and we've kind of pared this one down over the years. I mean, this originally started as an 8-hour class where we would talk about everything from the parts of a flare to, go into depth on some of the monitoring instrumentation and then talk about regulations and all those things. As the 4C evolved, our role kind of pared back to more of that regulatory side. And we've let the vendors kind of take over talking about their devices. So we are not really going to go into it. We can talk about it. We can do in-depth discussions on that, but it's not part of what we're diving into today. We're going to talk about, we kind of like to take this. I really enjoy taking flare regulation from when it started to where it is today, just to kind of because a lot of times people don't understand how we move from one regulation to another, and you really it's sometimes nice to see how that evolution happened and how we got to where we are today. We're going to focus a little more in detail on JA and MACT. They're final, they've been final, people are living under them right now, and then we will also talk about the new rules, EMACT, MON, and OLD. Throw a few little things that we've come across as people are now in that implementation stage. That all those sites are within their 3-year compliance window. So we're seeing some new folks come to the party and have to figure out what's going on. So we always like to just start off because there is some confusion about what a flare is. So we, how do you define what's a flare? Is it some people in the beginning, especially in the early days, like, NSPS, JA, and MACT, they talk about a flare is subject to this, but a vapor combustor is not subject to a rule. What about an incinerator? How do you parse those words? And that's another thing that we strive. We talk a lot about is words. And in our world, the words matter. Especially when it goes from regulation to implementation to consent decrees. There's so many words, there's so many different definitions, and they're so close that it's usually the minor differences that get people in trouble and cause a lot of confusion. So we like to really think about those words. So one of the biggest things when you think about whether or not it's a flare is whether or not you are controlling the amount of air in the combustion zone. And so if it is just basically open, like if it's the, if it's the obvious, stick flare, the flame is outside of the device. It's in ambient oxygen. There's no way to control the amount of ambient oxygen there. So, that one's most definitely a flare. We start getting into these, when you start looking at some of these enclosed flares, it's got a shroud around it. I mean, it's kind of enclosed, and people start saying, is it a flare? Is it a vapor combustor? And usually where we put that distinction is usually around the base. If you've got just big open doors and windows where the air is just naturally being drawn in, there's no way to control that air, we're going to say that's a flare. If you've got louvers that you can actuate and kind of dial in that air, then we're going to say that's a vapor combustor. So like, a lot of times we go out and see people say, oh, I got this flare at my wastewater treatment plant, where we'll go out and look at it and be like, that's not a flare, but that's a vapor combustor, because they're monitoring temperature to make sure that they're in compliance and getting that destruction. So, with the flares, we're not measuring for temperature to get that destruction. And then we have, I don't know if we really call these new anymore. I think their acceptance into the industry has grown over the years. But then we have the multi-point high pressure ground flares. And again, while they are in a protective shroud, a radiation shield, there's nothing to stop the air from coming into that zone. So again, we consider that those are all flare. And that pretty much rolls with the NSPS and MACT definitions. One of the big things also that will cause you, some people say, well, I just don't want to call it a flare. And you say, I'm gonna be smart and I'm gonna call this thing not a flare. Well, then you're going to be performance testing this device. So they're going to expect you then to, if you have a shrouded flare and you say it's not a flare, they're going to expect you to do some sort of performance test with, getting a stack testing company out there in order to measure, what's coming off of that device. So if you got the flare where flames can, exceed the height of your shroud, typically that is not always feasible. So that's where you kind of you can get into trouble if you don't want to call it a flare. Okay, so where did flaring start? That's always where we'll think about. Yep.
So, or the air.
But you don't control all the air. So it's still, the combustion is still out in the ambient oxygen. So you are providing that air for turbulence, but you're not, you can't control all of it. So really in MACT-CC, they added that word, an enclosed, if it's an enclosed combustion device, and that kind of caused some misconstrued, people not thinking about that word. But then again, some of the documentation from the EPA talked about being sufficiently enclosed. And so that kind of, is it enclosed enough that you can do a performance test on it? If you can't do a performance test on it, it's not enclosed enough. So that's another thing. So when we started, pulling oil out of the ground and separating it into fun products and doing fun chemistry, all those processes had vent gas. And so, before we had flares, they would vent to the atmosphere. They would create these nice clouds of explosive vapors, and they would blow up, and then we would have huge loss of life and equipment. And people said, what, this is a really bad idea. We really need a way to take those gases and take them somewhere where it's not going to cause damage to equipment or human life. So they started putting those gases into a pipe, taking it to another location, and to be able to safely combust them. So the earliest flares were these pit flares. So I mean, it just literally dug a hole in the ground, run a pipe down into that pit, throw a burning rag in, flare gun, light it off, boom, took care of your problems. Those pit flares are still in use today. Not that much, but they are still, there are still pit flares out there. But always remember that, where we started with flares is that the word safety. Safety is always what the flare is for, that's its primary purpose. So, that's where sometimes when people say, we want to control this or control that, it's like, we can do that to a point, but we can't control something down to the point where it can't function as that release point of high volumes of hot gases that are combustible. We need that place where that gas can flow freely and get to a safe place for destruction. In the beginning, of course, this was before environmental regulations. These were not used as environmental control devices. Nobody even thought two seconds about the environmental impact of a flare. So, but that's back in the day. So we'll talk about how that changed. So I started to allude to reasons to flare. Again, talk about some of these. You need a place to take those large volumes of hydrocarbons at high rate. You think of an upset that's happening in your unit. You got to get rid of that stuff as fast as possible. Or you touched on the distance. You want that's why the flare stacks are tall. You want that flame zone away from people, and also when they're really tall, it helps aid with dispersion. That's another thing to think about, especially when you think about these multi-point ground flares. I mean, they are great, but they're also at grade level. So, they don't have as much of that atmospheric dispersion that would occur with an elevated flare. But you can do some fun modeling in order to work around those issues. So, of course, then we get to, we start moving into when, 1970s, Clean Air Act, people start thinking about, we want something to control things or to help the environment. And then, of course, we start thinking of, we've got the flare. Flare is destroying these compounds. This could be a good place to have an environmental control device. But do we want the flare? I think that's one thing that when you hear, I get some of the signs out there, media and whatnot, it's like, people think that, people are flaring stuff all the time, where they're just burning all this gas. There's no, we're just horrible. They're burning all this gas. And it's like, we do all these, we do minimization assessments for people for their flares. And it's just like, when do you flare? Almost, we don't want to flare. If we're flaring, that means something is going wrong. Or it's like, or we specifically define this that we want to, we're only doing this because we have to. The process demands it. We don't want to flare. We want to keep all those nice hydrocarbons inside of our process so that we can turn those into saleable products and to make money off of them. Nobody makes money when you're flaring that gas. And also, it is I was like to say, the flare is also a highly visible sign of how wasteful a facility could be construed as being. So, I mean, if you're out there and you've got this huge flare burning bright every single day, and everybody that works there or drives by is going to say, like, that's a lot of energy that could probably put to a better use. So again, you're not wanting to. People don't want a flare, and that's what we predominantly found was that we would walk through all the connections with a site, talking to the operators, valve by valve by valve, and saying, when do you use this? What is it for? And there was always, there was always a reason, and there was always the drive to, we don't want to do that. So, I mean, we did not find that people wanted to flare. I think it was out of necessity that people flared. So then we get into this point where people start saying, well, I want to have, we're getting into the world of the environmental regulations, and people have to now think about emissions, quantifying emissions out of their flare. And so then the question was, well, how good is the flare for controlling emission? And so, back in you can see the day ranges, back in the 70s, the early 80s, that's when people started doing these studies. I mean, how do you figure out how something is done? You do a study, you do measurements, you figure out how well something can perform. And so we have these studies. I'm not going to talk about them in much detail, but you know, the big things to think about too, when we look at these studies, and people always start to wonder why we get certain regulations and why things had to happen, or why they happened in certain ways is, you look at these flares and you're like, you know, most of these are really small. You know, this is a, you know, even half inch. Isn't that like just a Bunsen burner? I mean, you're looking at something that's not exactly an industrial flare that's used out in the industry. So, you know, you do have some though. Here's a guy, Siegel, he was in Germany. He actually did a test on a flare used at a facility. It was a refinery, and so he did his testing there on that. But what did we learn? And also, you know, a lot of the time, when you're doing a test, where do you get your gas that you're combusting? So usually you're simulating the gas. You're using the gas that you can readily get to do a test. And also, you want to limit some of these variables when you're doing your testing. So you have, you know, people mixing propylene, nitrogen, propane, natural gas. You know, they're hitting some of the big compounds at some of these facilities, but you know, it's not for like, especially like refineries. They weren't using, you know, refinery flare gas. I mean, that's going to be a hodgepodge of all kinds of chemicals, and so you know that's going to be a little more complicated. But what do they find? They found, you know, you're looking at these numbers, you know, 99, 100, 92, 99. Did have some ones where they could show that you could get into trouble though. So I mean, that's the other thing. You just can't say, oh, it went to the flare, it got all busted up, we're all good. You know, they did say that, you know, there were some things that would affect how well that flare performs. And so that's where, you know, you get out of these flare testings and you start finding out what is affecting your flare performance. And so this is one, I mean, if you're in the flare world, you know about the McDaniel study. And, you know, this is where we start talking about this how does the steam impact flaring? And, you know, that's where we kind of, you got to think this was back in the 83, and then we have to move all the way up into the 2000 teens to get our regulations that are actually, you know, starting to talk about that steam impact to flaring. So, you know, it take a little time. But we knew, there were things we knew back all the way in the early 80s, and it's a little hard to see, you know, this is the old PDF that you can find online. It's a fun little study to read. They're appeal to me. But what they found was, so as down here is the steam to vent gas ratio, and here's the combustion efficiency. You can see the little black dots, so you can see I got low steam to vent gas ratios. You have really good combustion. And you're having really good combustion. Then with this number, sorry about this magic number 3. That number 3 is going to come up later when we're going to talk about some things. But once you get 3 to 1 steam to vent gas ratio, all of a sudden, boom, your combustion efficiency just falls off the cliff, as we like to say. So I mean, it really, that steam is helpful. I mean, why do we put steam to a flare? Steam helps control smoke. We don't want to have visible emissions that are flares, so we're going to put steam up there. But at some point, you put, you know, as we like to say, what do all Boy Scouts learn? Put enough water on fire, you're going to put it out. So, you know, that's where you get to the point where you add too much steam. Suddenly, you're going to impact that combustion efficiency and not do good combustion. Release gas ratio of 0.4 to 1.5 yield the best. So I mean, that's telling you that even back in the early 80s, with that concept of steam to vent gas ratio was known by people who dealt with flares, but it was known. So we had these studies in the 80s. We said, you know, EPA said yes, you can use a flare as a combustion control device or a control device. And that was a good thing. You know, everybody had it. So you got to always remember too that every facility had a flare because of the safety need. Well, now we can dual purpose this thing to be a control device. So now we're getting another, let's say more bang for your buck out of this one piece of equipment. So we were able to use this as a combustion device. Some of the key things that they talked about in these studies that affected flare performance. One is flame stability. How stable is your flame? Does anybody want to guess how did they define flame stability? It's whether or not there was a flame there.
Yeah.
If there's a flame, it's stable. If there's no flame, it's not stable. So I mean, it wasn't like the shape of this or whatnot. Discontinuous weight dominated flow. None of this. It was just, is there a flame or is there not a flame? If there is a flame, it's stable. So it wasn't as interesting as the word maybe make you think. You definitely tip design and vent gas composition is important. It affects combustion. So, we did all these tests where they would change up that mix in the gases. They would get different heat contents, and they knew that what you're sending to the flare will give you, the worse gas you send there, the worse combustion you're going to get. And so also with that composition, here's one of the good points. Vent gases of equal heating value, but a different composition, can have different combustion properties. So it's like, even though, we like to now, we talk about 270 and all is great, or 300 in the vent gas and all is great. It's not exactly always that cut and dry. It's a regulation, so they're going to do some averaging when they take what they're going to do. But we do know that what you're sending there is going to impact that combustion. Okay, so we had the testing. EPA said we can use this thing. So now we get into we got our first regulations. So that's, I don't know if we're going to cheer or not. But we had 2 regulations. One in 86 for the NSPS side. I assume everybody knows the difference between NSPS and MACT. If not, I'll quickly. It's a new source performance standard that's got you got to be a new source, or you have to modify your source and trigger that modification. Otherwise, until you've done those 2 things, you're not into the NSPS. So that's where a lot of people, when NSPS JA came out, there was a big push to say, have we really modified this flare? Because we don't want this added regulation. MACT is focused around destruction of HAPs. And it's pretty much, they don't have that trigger. Once you're in, based on your emissions from the plant. So they each got their version of this rule. They're almost exactly the same, word for word. There are a few words that are different, but they don't matter. Biggest thing is they set the basis for the things we still talk about today. No visible emissions. Smoking flares are bad. We all know that particulate matter in the air is not exactly healthy. So we like to be able to reduce that. Since we do have the ability to reduce smoke at a flare via steam, air, your assist gases, you can control that. So if we can't control it, let's limit it. You need to have and in the bin, they say a flame present at all times. They don't say which flame it is. So I think this point causes a little confusion because right after they say you need to have a flame present, they say you have to monitor your pilots. So I think a lot of people fixated on that. You need to have a pilot light. So the flame you need to have is the pilot light flame. But we like to say, if you have gases venting out your stack and you have lit pilot, but nothing's burning in the middle, it really didn't help out the situation. So we like to say you need to have a flame on top of your flare. Of course, if you have a FGR system where it's all taken away and you're not sending anything to your flare, that doesn't apply. But we want to say that if you're sending material to your flare, you should have a visible flame at the top. So then when they focused on this, you know, of course, when you're doing a regulation, you can't, and you have things such as refineries and petrochem sites that are gonna send a whole host of combinations of chemicals and all this unique stuff. You can't regulate composition at a flare. You can't say you have to meet a composition. So what did they do? They took that net heating value of gases going to the flare as a surrogate. So they basically said, we're gonna say you need to be above 300 BTU per stuff in the vent gas in the pipe going to the flare in order to meet that regulation. They felt that if you have at least that much BTU, you're gonna be okay. And we say with variation because of 300 BTUs if you have an assisted flare. If you have steam or air assist going to the flare, you gotta meet 300. If you have an unassisted flare, that number drops down to 200. So you gotta say, okay, so again, we knew that steam played a role in combustion. And so if you don't have steam or air up at that tip, you don't need to put as much energy into that flare. So again, there are hints in this process that tells you that they understood the impact of steam on the flare. And just to not cause confusion in anybody's head, I use the word steam most of the time because most flares are steam assisted flares, but typically the word air assist is the same as steam assist. So just confusion. The other thing you had to do was tip velocity. They were very concerned about how fast this gas is going out of the tip. So they felt like if you get the gas going too fast out of the flare tip, you're going to have poor combustion. Think that. I know there's a lot of people in this room, that row, that would probably disagree with that statement because you can get very good combustion moving gases very fast out of a flare. I mean, that's why we have multi-point ground flares now. They're moving the gas at sonic velocities out of these tips and getting great combustion. But alas, when they did these tests, you know, they didn't really have that. Maybe they didn't have. I don't know what they had in mind. So I don't know what they were thinking. But they came up with this limitation on exit velocity. So if the number most people think about is 60 feet per second, because also they put in again with variation, because you're limited to 60 feet per second unless you are monitoring the net heating value in the vent gas. If you're monitoring that net heating value in the vent gas, then you can calculate what we call Vmax. Vmax takes you from 60 feet per second up to 400 feet per second, and it's a little curve that you go up. The curve starts at 300, the curve ends at 1,000. So once you get above 1,000 BTU per scuff in your vent gas, you're now capped at 400 feet per second. So again, that's another thing to talk about is that number 400 feet per second. We talk about a lot because that is the hard and fast limit. And so we always like to remind people is how did we get 400 feet per second? I was just talking to Chris about that this week. And it's the fun things of saying, well, did you think that they saw the combustion drop off at 400? No, they just had to stop the test somewhere. Just can't keep going and going and going. It costs money to do these tests, so they stopped at 400. And so they stopped that test at 400. They submitted the result to the EPA, and this is one thing you always got to remember about the EPA. The EPA they have to use the information they have. They're not, I don't know that they're allowed to say, oh, well, I see the trend and the trend should keep going. They can't, they're not allowed to think that way. They have to say, I have data that proves good combustion at this number. I don't have a number that proves it, so I write my regulation like this. So you always got to remember, the data the EPA has is going to affect your regulation. So, but the testing did go past this, and they did continue to see good combustion at those flares, but the information was put out, but it did not get put out where the EPA took that information and used that in regulation. One of the big things is, so you're subject to, like, especially 60.18. You have to comply with this, this part. So if you're subject, so again, it's not everybody's into regulations and how they work. You have to be subject to an NSPS, and that NSPS has to point you back to Subpart A. So they're going to say, so say if you're a refinery and you're subject, or even a chem plant and you're subject to LDAR, you're subject to NSPS B, and you are using the flare as the control device to get out of some LDAR monitoring, it will then say, if you're using the flare, you have to follow Subpart A. So you always get pointed back to Subpart A as why you have to comply with it. But they did say that, applicable subparts can give you other requirements. And so guess what? How many subparts actually had different requirements? We had none until we got to NSPSJ. So, I mean, it took all that time for a single subpart to try to say, I want you to do something different with your flare. So everything has been just pointing back to Subpart A forever. So we didn't really get those big changes until J&J. One of the big questions that everybody asks is, do we have a performance test in under 60.18? And again, just for no confusion, when I say 60.18, I am also saying 6311. I just don't want to say it all. Is, do we have a sub-performance test? You can go through the 5 pages that 60.18 is. It's not very long. And look for the words performance test. Words performance tests are not used within Subpart A. However, they do have this little part, and I think it's actually a footnote to the equation that says you're going to determine the net heat value as measured by a method 18 test. So that was kind of that they slipped in, you're going to do a test as part of 60.18. So everybody then ran around and, pretty much everybody's done. I won't say everybody. Most people have done a 60.8 flare test where you have a company come out, they measure the BTUs in the flare, you're above 300, great. They usually at the same time do a visible emissions test. So you, again, check a box, great. I have my 2-hour visible emissions check, and you move on. You have to redo that performance test. There's nothing in the rules that says you do. Most people, if you make a significant change to the gas, if like you add another unit in your process, you get rid of a unit in your process that was going to that flare, you may want to consider doing another test just to make sure you haven't had such a change in concentration that you may not be meeting this requirement. So we do see them redone from time to time, but it's not an annual thing. It's even an every decade thing. Sometimes we ask people, hey, can you show me your performance test? And they dig and bring me out this old dusty file that, from the 80s that said, yes, I performance tested my flare. They're like, are you in compliance? I'm like, you have a performance test? I don't know that you haven't changed this thing so many ways that you should have done another one, but you can. Okay, so we move into this another document that a lot of people use, especially if you're in permitting. You use AP42 a lot because that gives you emission factors, and so you really want to run that. But I think everybody knows they're usually worse emission factors, but they're the ones that we use for a lot of permitting. There is a AP42 for flares. It has some interesting stuff. It has some, and it has changed. So I'll get to that in a second. But when it came out in the 90s, talks about the flare, and I always love that we like to point out just these things that just strike us as odd. Is noise and heat are the most apparent undesirable effects of flare operation. Noise and heat. Have we said anything in these regulations dealing with noise or the heat, the radiant heat coming from a flare? No. So again, so it's like, okay, that's an interesting choice of words. And then, but the other thing we do like this because it talks about emissions from flaring includes, and then it lists a lot of things. You're gonna have soot coming from your flare. Oh, wait, it said I'm not allowed to have no visible emissions. But it says we're gonna get soot, okay? Unburned hydrocarbons, okay, so we're not gonna have 100% combustion efficiency. So I mean, and partly burned and altered. I think that's something that, you know, when everybody says flaring, we got EMACT, we got RSR, I think that eventually that part is going to come back. And industry will then be dealing with altered hydrocarbons in the future, but I don't want to scare you guys too much. You're gonna have NOx. If you have sulfur in the stuff that you flare, you're gonna have SO2 emissions. The refineries are to be aware of that. I think that most a lot of petrochemical sites will also have that. Quantities of these hydrocarbons generated relates to the degree of combustion. And what does that degree relate to? Is that fuel air mixing and flame temperatures. Again, with the flame temperatures. I mean, I guess, you know, they've now said temperature twice, but we don't use temperature at all when we're talking about flame. But this is the thing that we were all hoping for, and that was we get properly operated flare. So they did give themselves some wiggle words. It achieves at least 98% combustion efficiency. So that was what everybody wanted. Everybody said, because they didn't know otherwise. How do you know what the emissions are coming from a flare? I mean, back then, you know, people weren't bringing out the crane and trying to measure those emissions. They just wanted a factor. And so this is where we finally got our 98% combustion efficiency. So that was good. But you know, the world does change, and they did update AP 42 back in 2018. So I mean, in the middle of all this flaring, the changes that were after regulation, they decided to also update AP 42. They brought in some work. They started talking about over steaming, the combustion zone properties, and they do talk about the refinery sector with its 270 BTU per SCUF. And so again, some of the things that people think about is like when you have it now these concepts are in AP 42, and this is where everybody goes to AP 42 and looks at this. So now you also remember this is going to play into something we're going to talk about a little later with the enforcement. Is now industry should know about these impacts. So it's kind of that one of those things is if industry wants to say we didn't know that we were having these problems, and we didn't know we were supposed to be operating our flare certain ways. Well, now we have lots of documentation that's starting to point to the fact that, well, you really should know, because now we have all these places where it is said that you need to be concerned about this thing. So it's creating that ability to say you should know what's going on in your flare. You should be controlling certain things. We do they did change some things on those most notable impacts, and I love this. Is noise heat and a visible flame. So what did we talk about? What you want to have at the top of your flare when you're sending gas there? You want a flame on top of your flare. So how can having the one thing that is actually causing the destruction of the pollutants be one of the most apparent undesirable effects of this thing? So it's like, I understand the whole public don't like to see the flickering light in their windows, and I get that. But again, we want to see a visible flame on top of our flares, because that's one of the various signs that it's operating correctly or close to correctly. They also moved, seemed like there was also a big move in not only regulation, but 842, that is they moved from this term of combustion efficiency to destruction efficiency. I don't think that was why the difference is, but just quickly, you know, if you're getting full combustion, you're taking the hydrocarbon all the way to CO2 and water. Destruction efficiency just means that the thing that you send to the combustion zone is not that thing anymore. So you can send benzene to the flare, it can burn up, but it doesn't mean that it's CO2 and water. It could turn into all kinds of different compounds, but it's just not benzene anymore. So you can have a very high destruction efficiency, but that doesn't mean you actually got full combustion. Visible emissions. As we said, a smoking flare is undesirable.
I ask you about
Yep.
this. AP42 and NSPS, how are they connected? Of course, the same code, but how are they connected?
I mean, it's not necessarily that they're connected. AP42 is not regulated. So it's AP42, I think of as kind of a guidance document that provides people with a source of emission factors, a way to quantify emissions. And so it's, they're not really linked, I would say. They're just, you use AP42 when you're doing your permitting to show you're going to meet the regulations. So
They're not technically.
no, they're not.
And NSPS talked about Subpart A. How are the structure that their parts and the subparts?
Oh, yeah. So the A is like, so NSPS is chapter 40, CFR 60. That's the subpart. And then within part 60, there are A, B, C, D, there's actually D, A, C. So they'll have little numbers, so that's when we get to NSPS. J is another subpart, and then they have JA.
So 60 is the part, it's part 60.
So yeah, part 60 is NSPS, and MACT, which is usually 61 and 63. So like when we say NSPS, that's usually 61, it's in the MACT standard for 63. So again, they have lists of subparts. Usually it's all about who they're regulating. So each part deals with a different regulated entity. And so that's where you're kind of, how people will say, oh, I have a EMACT flare, but I'm not a MON flare. Or like, they'll say, or they'll have a list of subparts that they're subject to. And sometimes they'll look at what and say, why aren't you subject to this? And they figured out a way to get out of regulation. And so it's just regulatory applicability. Good question. Okay, smoke. So again, we don't like smoke. How do we measure smoke? So again, you have a device that is free-burning in the atmosphere. It's not like we can't put an opacity meter across a stack and actually measure that opacity. I think today, technology is moving. We are moving to technologies that are able to detect smoke and do those kind of determinations. So, that's another way that technology is getting better. But back in the day, we didn't have any of these things, so they're all based on your eyeballs. So you have EPA method 9 and 22. I would say for the most parts. I mean, that's different states do things a little differently, but generally from the federal perspective, you don't do method 9 on a flare. Method 9 is where you're actually assigning opacity number to emissions. Method 22 is another means of looking at the flare. You're just saying smoke or no smoke. You're not trying to quantify that opacity. So if somebody has a state restriction to say you can't have opacity greater than 40% out of this fire source or whatever, you have to then do a method 9 because you need to get a number to meet that. But flares are just no visible emissions. Doesn't matter if it's 5% or 80%, that's the same in their eyes. So that's why we use method 22. And also method 9, you got to go to smoke school, you got to get certified to do a method 9 reading. EPA method 22 is you just have to be suitably educated to do the method. one of the suitability ways to be trained is, oh, get trained is nothing nine. So, I mean, they're very similar, but it all has to do with positioning yourself so you're not staring into the sun and the flare and trying to see things, you know, there's a whole host of things you gotta do. But we had all these neat little charts to try to say how bad the smoke was or what you needed to meet. Like sometimes you see, I don't know, maybe you guys can tell me, if you guys still see people requiring a Ringgold number out of a,
Yes.
they do still do that? Okay.
Almost every city.
Okay, it's like one of those things, like, we know it exists, but it's like we never talk about the
I
Ringgold.
mean, in the US, it's always.
Yeah.
But outside of the US, it varies. It's more or less, some say less. But you get the two.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's interesting.
If we would have to have that documented by somebody who certified. Yeah, we have certified standards.
Yeah, I did at one point, but I decided I didn't want to go sit in the parking lot twice to keep up my certification. Plus, when you walk into industrial facilities and you're a trained smoke reader and you look up at a stat, you know, you kind of don't want to be able to say to somebody, you know, you're not meeting your permit requirement. I'd rather be uncertified than not say, you know, that doesn't look so good. But so, okay, so we had the old stuff, you know, that kind of set the baseline of what everybody's trying to do. Then we moved into we did have to add there the quotes to recent because, you know, time does roll. And we talk about stuff in 2000 now, you know, that's 20 years ago. So I mean, we can't really call that recent. So we have different things that came out, you know, that we're going to talk through a couple of these ones. Just to say that, you know, we're not just basing everything off of these old tests in the 80s. There have been newer tests. One of the biggest ones that I think, and this is one we always like to talk through just because this is when you know about the you know, flare enforcement initiatives. You know, this is the case that really brought flaring onto EPA's radar, that really kicked off all of that major flare enforcement. So there was a facility, an EOS facility in Addison, Ohio. You know, small town, you know, a lot of chemical plants are in small towns. But it's, and then, you know, it was a small town where this was the only industrial facility in that town. We're not talking a ship channel where there's tons of plants where you point fingers everywhere. This was the only. And they like to make acrylonitrile and 1,3-butadiene. So, you know, it was dealing with some not so nice materials. And sometimes when you go to these small towns, you know, I've seen it firsthand, is you go to drive in and you pull up to the site, you look one way, you see a plant, you look the other way, and you see an elementary school. You know, you always think about that siting, who sited those things right next to each other, but you end up with an elementary school across the street from a chemical facility. So what they do, they put a air monitor on top of the elementary school. They're monitoring the ambient air around that school, and they start seeing hits, large hits, acrylonitrile, 1,3-butadiene. So of course, that sets off lots of alarms when you have that with children. So everybody, EPA descends on this facility. You know, they bring out everybody. They have people scouring this facility, you know, FLIR cameras, doing leak checks everywhere. Everybody's searching for the leak that is causing this. The facility itself also, all hands on deck. We got to figure out, where is this material coming from? They're looking everywhere and they can't find it. They cannot find the leak. And then somebody had the thought to take this FLIR camera and look up. And suddenly they look up and they see the flare. They see a lot of hydrocarbons coming out of this flare stack. And so they say, oh, okay, let's go figure out what's going on at this flare. And so they go and, of course, on the news, that picture's from the news. And, what's the one thing we don't see? We've said it multiple times today. What's the one thing we don't see on top of that flare stack? There's no flame. What did we say is a good thing to have on top of your flare? It's a flame. So they had no flame. So they went and looked at how they were operating that flare. And when they looked at the steam to vent gas ratio, anybody have a guess as to the number of that steam? Remember we said combustion falls off a cliff at 3. Anybody know the number? It was 500 to 1. So, zero combustion is happening.
So it's called.
No smoke, exactly. Well, the funny thing is that, they of course do more investigation of why are you guys operating your flare that way? And it wasn't smoke. It was the community action group. So, they all have the community action group and they meet with the plant and they want to be good neighbors and they say, what are we doing? Are we doing anything that you guys aren't liking? What do you have? They go, no, everything's great. We just don't like that light flickering in our windows at night. Is there anything you can do about this? And they're like, oh, yeah. We'll just turn up that steam a little bit, drop that flame down a little bit. And they go, okay, come back, anything we need to do? And they're like, well, yeah, we still see that flame. And we just don't like that flame. Okay, turn it up until they got to the point where they're basically just direct venting.
That's how you use salt and don't blame it on all that.
Yeah, they basically had turned that flare up as the steam up and up and up until the point where they're just like, well, it's never smoking, but they don't ever have to touch the steam either. There was no reason to. Like, again, it was that connection between oversteaming was just something that they weren't thinking about. They were just trying to be nice neighbors and knock out the flame.
Someone would have thought of or had nothing.
Yeah, you'd think somebody would have thought about it, but
I mean, you'd be surprised. We've been in plants before where they're in this very same situation. And we come and they say, hey, you have an odor. Why is this odor? We work with the operations very good condition. And we have one instance where one of our process engineers got it in a good condition. They went to lunch and the plant manager called the operator we were with at lunch and said, why is there a fire up there? Put the steam back on. And he was like, we have a vendor here and that's not how we operate this. Well, we can't have a fire up there. And so it's an education thing, right? There's a lot of people that still need the education of what properly operated.
yeah, we did very similar things as when we were going around for RSR implementations. We would go to the control operator and just be like, so where are you set at? And they're like, oh, yeah, our valves are at like 20% over. Like, okay, we can see looking at the screen and we're just like, okay, we're like, dial that back a little bit. And they they say, okay, yeah, we can do that. Take it back, and then whoosh, up comes that flat fire. We're like, okay, that's where you need to be. We're like, you are way over where you need to be. You need to dial back that steam until you can see a nice flame on top of your flare, because otherwise, this is the problem. So when EPA found this, again, they're thinking, okay, no, the industry, they know they should be operating these things for. This is an isolated incident. That's what they said. They said, well, let's go see. So this was up in Region 5. And so they went around to all these facilities and they got the shock of their lifetime. They found out that no, this is not an isolated incident. This is general operating procedure for all these facilities, or not all, but most facilities in this region. And when that happened, that's when you started seeing the flare enforcement initiatives come out. You saw, all that in I said this is up in Region 5. You look at the original flare consent decrees, they were all pretty much in Region 5. So, I mean, they jumped on that like crazy. And, what does success breed? It allows people to copy. So what happened in Region 5 then got distributed out to the rest of the regions, and that's where you saw EPA enforcement suddenly now start picking up in all these different regions, and you saw that kind of ramp up, that enforcement really ramp up, and they got their consent decrees, and then they used those consent decrees to then get a new regulation.
These are these
Yeah, no.
These regions are these state-wise or these are federal?
Not federal, so EPA is carved up the country into about 9 EPA regions, and so, they just have different zones. If you just Google EPA regions, you'll pull up a map. Different regions like that. I live in Georgia, so, I'm in region 4, region Texas, region 6. It's different, but it's also interesting that certain regions don't have a lot of the same issues. So it's like for region 6 is all about refining and petrochemical. You go to region 4 and there's like 2 refineries. Region 4, it's like their knowledge base on what happens at chemical plant all over. So it's like they're not all, because of what they deal with every day, the plant turnover that they have, the training is the same, the knowledge is the same. So, you definitely see different regions have different impacts on their community. I mean, we know facilities that are on the border, and it's a company that has a facility in one region and a facility in another region, and they say this facility gets hammered by their region. The other facility never gets asked a question, and it's just about regions. So it just it kind of spiraled out from this case. We always just like to talk about this one because that's the one we say that enforcement. So we have kind of just to reinforce the concept. So again, visible emissions, those both. I think we're getting good combustion. California and move towards a big minimization. That was one thing I didn't talk about was if you go to California, it's a much different environment than the rest of the country. I mean, especially like up in the Bay Area where they have this bunch of refineries sitting around San Francisco Bay. So they have a much different approach to flaring up there. And up there it is, you're not flaring. If they have a flaring event, they literally get like a ticket. They will get cited if they have a flare or a flame on top of their flare. So but what did that cause? Every single facility there has a large flare gas recovery unit, and they are sucking away all those gases so that they do not have a flame on top of their flare. They don't want a flare. And that's where you also saw a lot of this push to, hear a lot of people say, well, I got to do a startup. I got to do a shutdown. I got a flare. And it's like, well, in California, they started to figure out how to do that without flare. So, I mean, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of timing. It's not a straightforward process, but they have done startup shutdown events with very minimal flare. So, I mean, that's kind of where we maybe expect a lot more facilities to start to move to. But also you got to think if they didn't flare it, that means they were able to keep that material, and maybe that helps them out in some other way. I don't know. They would have that idea, but but I mean, it was crazy because I was talking to a facility out there, and literally they had a hydrogen vent. They had I forget what ESA unit or what. It's a high purity hydrogen, and they had a vent for it, straight down. It's not a balloon. And I was just like, and we were talking about the flare, and then we were talking about supplemental gas. And I was like, well, you know what? I was like, I don't just take that hydrogen and use that as flare that so that you have good BTUs there. And I was like, flare? Have a visible flame? And they looked at me like I was crazy. They were just like, oh no. We're gonna bend our hydrogen. We are not going to put our hydrogen into our flare. That's insanity. And I was just like, okay, I will not give that, that advice anymore. But so they've done a huge thing towards pushing to no flaring. And it's also interesting to see most of that now. A lot of the refineries in California are also now surrounded by communities. I mean, where you see the old picture on the wall from when the refinery was built, and you can't see a house around it. Now there's neighborhoods ringing the property line. And you're just like, it's changed a little bit around in some of those areas. The Texas event, that was just one where TCEQ, when trying to match up event reporting with ambient monitors, they started to find out that the event reporting, or basically what they were seeing at the air monitors and what they were being told was emitted from the facility were not matching up. And so if the facility says, well, we flared X amount of material and we had 98% destruction efficiency, well, that should have had a concentration of X, and we saw a much higher concentration at our stations. And so that, again, reinforced the idea of flares not being operated directly as we talked about the Ohio case. So when we started noticing all these things, and then we say, well, we probably need to do some more testing. So the TCEQ ran another test. And so they designed the Johnson facility, and so they had steam assisted and air assisted flares that they tested. Before they did the test, they went out and surveyed industry to basically say, how big's your flare? Because they wanted to do these tests on a somewhat representative size flare. They also know, what are you flaring routinely? What kind of flow rates are we talking about here? So they want to not focus in on that. But I always like to say, so they had they did the test, and they showed that, again, proving that you can get really good combustion. See, that gas ratio, down 0.29. Move it up, increase that steam. Okay, now we're starting to see some visible steam. You still see some flame there. So we're still getting around 90%, but that's not 98. And then we get up to this one thing. Steam vent gas ratio just over 1. And we're down at 27% combustion efficiency. So again, we were saying at 3 it falls off a cliff. Well, again, this is a whole thing about flow rates, compositions will impact combustion. So you can make a flare perform really bad at a steam to vent gas ratio of 1 to 1. So these numbers that we're using in regulation, and I had this conversation this week, was these numbers in regulation shouldn't be a design basis. It's like we talk about these things, but nobody should be designing. You should be designing your flares, with the people that know how to design your flares. We don't want to say that the regulation should, tell you that, oh, I can do 3 to 1, or the consent decree that says, oh, I can, as long as I'm below 3 to 1, I'm okay, because you can see that 3 to 1 is not a good number. But we had, I think this test cost at least $2 million, and it took a lot of time. A lot of people, donated their time. Huge effort. What did we learn with $2 million? Put water on a fire, it goes out. We did that, $2 million. So again, it's we're reinforcing what we already know. So EPA, so with this whole understanding of steam has now been confirmed that the steam affects that, and just again to reiterate, they did the testing on air flares as well. Similar results were found. You put too much air to a flare, you're going to get more combustion. So again, steam there similar, but not exactly the same. But then we got to this. So then remember the regulation said you need to have 300 BTU per scuff here in the header. That's where everybody was complying with, was that gas content here. Well, now EPA says, well, we now realize that this is not good. This is not good. Well, it's not good enough to ensure good combustion. So now they're going to shift up to here and say, I want to make sure that you have a high enough heat content up here to show. So you have to account for that amount of steam that you're putting to the flare tip. So you're now accounting for the steam. Steam has a 0 net heating value. So that's going to bring down your average quickly. So again, it incentivizes you to put as little steam as you can out there while remaining solid. I assume most people, at least the two facilities here, received this. It went out to, I know, we went out to every refinery and a whole bunch of chemical facilities. We tried to, and the funniest thing was, so of course, we're consultants. We say people got this, facilities got this. Yes, to us, what is that? That's a client list. And so we asked, we went and did a FOIA and said basically, EPA, we want that list of who you sent it out to. You know what the response was? No, this is part of an enforcement matter, and we can't give you that that information. And we're like, wait a second, you sent out a notice, and that's enforcement? Or I mean, like that's a pretty. We thought that was a little bit of an overreach there to call sending out a notice enforcement. But so we were not given this list. What we know that now. Most large facility. One of the big things was the big excessive SO2 emissions. Derek's going to talk about J and JA and that whole evolution. So I won't go into it, but they basically said they had an NSPS Subpart J, and then they felt that they even worse, need for the conways not compliant. Then again, we got this new enforcement initiatives. Back in 2014, 2015, where they said, yes, we're still going to do this. Back during the Trump administration, people were wondering, is it going to, the environmental enforcement, is it going to slow down? One of the things we found was other things did slow down. The flare stuff did not slow down, not one bit. Flare enforcement continued on, same as before. So, they didn't give up on that. And, it kind of shifted over time. I can't say who, but we know that, so the refineries were the highest ones getting the consent decrees for a while. We'd say that has definitely shifted over to the chemical sector. While now was the last one, Shell Chemical got one for Norco, and Exxon got consent decree for their chemical side. There are more coming. That's all I'm going to say. So they have not stopped, and more consent decrees will be coming out. They are oddly slowly coming out, but they are coming out. Okay, so we moved again. So we had all these testing, know about it, had all these consent decrees. So then what did we finally get? We got MACT for refinery sector revised. So then that really added put into regulation all these flaring requirements. So again, we have had, since RSR came out, we've still had consent decrees. These were two refineries, and then these have all moved into chemicals. So you haven't really, well, there has been, I didn't put it up there, there has been other flaring related consent decrees, but they were more event-based than like systematic not operating your flares correctly.
When did the RSR?
Stars.
Final rulemaking was December 1st, 2015.
2015. Yeah.
I know that Shell, about it.
Yeah, that was earlier.
That was before that.
Yeah.
And I know it's supposed to take something that before the ones that they could get, they will follow the Shell's directives.
Yeah.
Whatever that was decided. I thought that eventually became.
Yeah. So a lot of the consent decrees, once the RSR was published, and it was interesting because enforcement and rulemaking, I'm holding up two hands because they are two separate entities within the EPA. They don't really do a lot of interchange there. So the rule writers, they write rules, and the enforcement people, they do enforcement. And when previous to the RSR, was the enforcement people who were deciding how these companies had to comply. And then rule writers came in and put in their rules, and they weren't the same. They were similar, but they were definitely had differences. And so we saw once RSR came out, that was especially, I think, Citgo Lamont was actually, it was negotiated during the transition. And so they were going down one path with the old style CD, and then RSR came out, and then basically their CD changed to what it is today, where it's follow RSR. So I think once that rule was there, the enforcement side had to shift. They couldn't say you have to do what we want because there is a rule. And so now everything has changed to you would need to follow the rule. So that was a definite change. So, you think about Marathon and BP and some of those ones, it's like they had these consent decrees that didn't say follow the rule. They had their own requirements. So for them to then now say, I only have to follow the RSR, now they have to open up their CD, go through another negotiation in order to change that. I don't know that they've actually changed their CDs.
Marathon updated theirs in order to get permission to install flare gas recovery. Their flare minimization steps didn't do enough, so they ended up having to install flare gas recovery. So they incorporated that into their CD, and now that the CDs mirror the regulations. The biggest part of a CD now that differs from the regulations is a requirement for flare gas recovery.
Yeah.
So that's the big hook now.
Yeah. So if you're talking about, if you're like a rule, the rule just says do a minimization assessment, but the CDs are always, you will be talking about flare gas recovery a lot. And most of them end up with at least some amount of flare gas recovery. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over. Oh, let's take a break. It is 9:14. Should we say 10 minutes? 9:20, well, 9:25. We'll do 11 minutes. I'm a generous guy.
Yeah.
11 minutes, we will start back up.
It's a random button. I just remember it all.
Okay.
So you're learning a lot.
Oh, it's hard.
I almost said 301. I knew it was in the hundreds.
Yeah.
I did know 500.
Yeah.
Everything I can do is the question.
Oh, yeah. I haven't been to Chicago in a long time.
Wow. You know why?
Yeah.
Last time I was in Chicago was when the couple of series. Yeah.
Oh, man. Yeah, I would say just hit the highlight.
Breeze through J8.
Because that took an hour and a half, so.
Yeah, or 15 minutes really, so, yeah.
So, aperture.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I would breeze through JA and then.
Yeah, I'm gonna reconfirm real quick, 'cause we had a couple people kind of.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, just to be sure, and then if you folks came in later. Our refinery folks, but
Hell, I would still just go that early.
you've been living under this for 5 years. You should go.
Exactly. If you're not complying, you got bigger problems.
Though, you might be one of those people who's on talking to the EPA and like.
Well, yeah, because these things are on. Can't talk in front of the lights. Yeah.
Maybe I started with some 5 transit guy.
Oh, it's gonna be like, this is a great road.
This is good.
Because I would have just said, let's skip to the end.
We ended up at 14, at 14 out of
Ah.
although we had 14 come back. Yeah. Alexis is fascinating. It's cold in here.
I'm upstairs. I was thinking awesome.
Yeah, all that, I think those things are terribly. No, I don't remember this. It being chilly last couple of days.
No. Yeah.
Today feels chilly.
Yeah, I thought yesterday was almost hot.
Yeah. Yeah, at the high points, get to max AC. Marathon has their original CD, their amended CD, and the thesaurus.
Oh, that's right. I've never heard that BP changed theirs.
Not that I've ever heard, but I also have never really heard anything from Whiting.
Yeah,
I mean, I assume maybe, I mean, they put FGR in everything anyway. So,
that's true.
apart from that, tweaking it to that, to me, RSR reminded me of some language about RSR superseding their CD or something. Yeah. They had an error. It's
One minute.
eight. This is just what I was predicting. I said 8. But when I'm talking.
Oh, we are doing some. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Becker Hughes. Back over there.
Yeah, no, he's seen that before. I thought
You recognize this?
Yeah. Yeah, he's seen him before.
The guy is out of talking here, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that guy.
That's not the player. That's it. So, yes. Looks a few more minutes.
So, go. Yeah, that's clear.
All right, well, we are going to keep on moving because we are on somewhat of a time limit, and I think everybody would like to get to the new stuff here. So my section is going to focus on the existing flare regulations that we've seen promulgated over the last 15, 20 years. So really, we're going to focus at the moment on NSPS JA and MACT or RSR. And just know that as I'm talking, Herman's going to touch on this more when he comes back up after my section, and the EMACT and MON that I'm sure many people have heard of mirror many of the requirements that I'm going to talk about in MACT and RSR. So even if you're not a refinery, these are probably going to apply to you in some way, shape, or form. The NSPS JA is a refinery specific regulation. It's focused on monitoring rather than control. So whereas we talk a lot about maintaining 270 BTU in the combustion zone and making sure we have good destruction efficiency, NSPS JA was not overly concerned about that. It was more concerned about the idea of let's know how much gas is going to your flare and the sulfur content of that gas. So JA, the compliance date was back in 2015, November 11. And any new flare at a refinery is subject to the requirements of JA as soon as it were to be started up. So that same flare would also be subject to RSR. So there's a lot of moving parts for a new flare. If a new flare is built, and in our thought process, a new flare is not just a new stack. If you have an existing flare that you decide for whatever reason you're going to replace the stack, that is not necessarily a new flare, because the gas that's going to that flare and the definitions of a flare in NSPS JA are specific, and that the flare is not just the stack. The flare is the header all the way back to the relief valves, manual valves that vent to the flare. So we have taken the stance usually that stack replacement or a tip replacement does not mean a new flare is being installed. So those flares, now it may be a modification, I'll touch on in a minute, but the highlights of the rule, again, new sources, NSPS standards, so new sources or modified sources. One of the things that EPA had done previous to NSPS JA was they had published NSPS J, which is another NSPS for refineries, similar sulfur limits, what we saw in JA. The issue was that the definition of what constituted a modification was not very specific when it came to flares. And so most facilities decided that they had not modified their flare. What JA really changed was the definition of what a modification to a flare became very, very specific and very, very easy to trigger. And so that really brought in the vast majority of refinery flares to comply with NSPS JA. So I touched on this already. It's flow and sulfur monitoring required under JA. This was the first instance of the EPA asking sites to develop a flare management plan. There was also, as part of that, a minimization assessment, which required you to assess at-source reduction of flaring, at-source or removal of the gas that's sent elsewhere, sweep and purge minimization, and an assessment, not a requirement to install, but an assessment of flare gas recovery and a justification of why it would not be feasible at your particular facility. The rule includes a number of root cause analysis thresholds that require additional investigation and potentially corrective action. So these are all trends that we see continued on in RSR. So all phrases and words. Okay. The root cause analysis thresholds for NSPS JA are flow and sulfur based, because that's what we're monitoring. And so these are requirements. One is 500,000 scuff above your baseline, which JA allows flares to set, and then 500 pounds of SO2 in the 24-hour period. I'm not going to touch a monitoring alternative, but JA, unlike RSR, JA did have some provisions that made it a little easier for true emergency flares to meet the requirements of the rule. So flares with water seals specifically that only bust the seal 4 times or less in a 365-day period, or granted some allowances and reduced monitoring provision. However, they tripped it for a 5th time, they were in the game within 180 days. Anybody who works at a plant knows that actually getting a project approved, installed, and operational in 180 days is probably not feasible. So there were a couple flares that went this route. Those that I know of that did are no longer in this monitoring. They've all eventually decided to go in the full route. Just RCA is the requirements to documentation to include in the root cause analysis and corrective actions. Some of those emissions information collected from your flow meter and your sulfur analyzers, and then just documentation of what was done and the corrective actions you're going to implement as a result of it. Flow monitoring requirements, these are ultimately very similar, if not identical, to what is explicitly stated in the RSR. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but we'll see these again under RSR. Volumetric flow, standard conditions, and maintainable online. Sulfur monitoring requirements. There are 2 different sulfur monitoring requirements that NSPS JA requires. One is a limit of 162 ppm H2S in the vent gas. The other is that RCA threshold we mentioned earlier, 500 pounds of SO2 in a 24-hour period. So ultimately, the rule allows for a single instrument to do both of these. In practice, though, most facilities ended up installing 2 instruments, one on that low span and one on that high span. The high span instrument is supposed to be done 1.1 to 1.3 times the maximum anticipated sulfur concentration, which for many refineries, since they have SRUs, sulfur recovery plants, that number is very, very high. It's very common for us to see 100% H2S as the maximum span for those instruments. And so having an instrument that was accurate all the way down to 5 ppm range for the low span and up to 100 ppm was not very common. So we saw a lot of folks going with GCs or tunable diode lasers for H2S, and then installing total sulfur instruments like the Atom or the Solid 2 for the SO2. There are some exemptions for inherently low sulfur gas, things like natural gas. Pilot gas is explicitly mentioned as a low sulfur gas. Typically it is natural gas, but it does open up a weird window of send anything to your pilots and okay. Might do some terrible things to your pilots, but as we've talked about with a couple folks during the course of this conference, pilots are something that, even though they've been in the regulations since 1984, since before I was born, we still spend an unusual large amount of time talking about pilots and the requirements, monitoring of those pilots. So even though 37 years of pilot regulations, we're still talking about them in great detail. Performance testing. JA did have some amendments published as connected to when the December 1st publication of the refinery sector rule. Some of them related to tweaking the flow monitoring accuracy requirements. JA used to require what was a plus or minus 5% sensitivity on the flow meter. Doesn't really mean anything. If you went to talk to any of the flow meter manufacturers, they might kind of know what you're talking about because of JA, but that wasn't something that they specified at the time. So what the amendments that were put in with the RSR, the accuracy requirements under NSPS JA match those in the RSR. So fortunately, we're not dealing with multiple sets of accuracy requirements. The amendments also included the requirement to perform an initial performance test for that H2S instrumentation. And so that's something that if you, similar to the Subpart A performance testing requirement, if you don't have documentation of it, you may want to consider looking at that if you are subject to the rule, and because it's supposed to be done within 180 days of startup. QA/QC requirements, depending on in the instrumentation that's installed, performance spec 7 or performance spec 5. Those will not going to spend too much time talking about those, but are subject to them. Make sure you're following the right regulation. All of these pretty standard in the SIMS world. Daily calibrations, CGAs, RADAs, etc. Flare management plan. So again, this NSPS JA was the first regulation that put forth this idea that you're going to have all of the information for your flare pulled together in one place. Previous to this, yeah, sites probably had their tip drawing. They've probably got their original design specs for the flare, but it's all scattered. You might be in a file here, a file over there. FMP pulls it all into one place. So in addition to the description of the flare itself, the tip, the height, etc. It's also documentation of the units connected to the flare, the individual connections, and that minimization assessment that we've talked about previously, where the rule does specify some things that have to be addressed there. And so it's a spot where all of that gets pulled into one spot. It's also where the instrumentation that's installed in the flare is also documented. JA, we saw a number of alternative monitoring plans specifically related to those high span sulfur gases. They were largely safety focused, and the instrument manufacturers worked with sites to say we can use a lower sulfur gas, safer, and still get the good results. EPA was pretty amenable to those alternative monitoring plans, in large part because rather than a emissions limit that we were dealing with, was an RCA threshold, so I think they were more willing to be flexible on that. Records required to keep, FMP is required to be maintained on site. That is a submitted document. There are specific things that require resubmittal under JA, FGR, other modifications to the flare. And then records of the RCAs and corrective actions that are done, as well as the result through QA/QC activities on instrumentation. All right, so that was a quick run through of NSPS JA. Don't want to spend too much time on that because just a quick poll, still nobody from Refinery in the room. Oh. Okay. Any questions then before I move on to RSR or MACT-CC? Okay. So MACT-CC is when we talk about modern flare regulations, MACT-CC is the first of the bunch. And it takes the work that was done in the consent decrees and starts to codify it into actual regulations. And the goal behind MACT-CC is to make sure that these flares are operated to achieve a 98% destruction efficiency. So as Herman touched on with the Addison experience, the EPA had come to realize that most flares were not probably being operated to achieve 98% destruction efficiency. Indeed, we've worked with sites that have in their original documentation indications of you should operate it, and very few are actually following those procedures. MACT-CC takes a lot of the requirements we talked about in Subpart A, moves them into the MACT-CC regulations, and severs this connection between refinery flares and the general provisions, and adds monitoring requirements, clarifies existing monitoring requirements for flares, and also specifies a time period under which we're supposed to be looking at these limits. Previously, there's no real specification for pilots or net heating value of the vent gas. MACT-CC establishes it's a 15-minute block, so it speeds things up significantly. And that's a change even from the consent decrees as well, which generally focused on hour or 3-hour averages. And so that's been the big driver as well of making sure you have instrumentation that can meet this quicker operational time period. So MACT-CC timeline, as we touched on earlier, first rule was initially proposed in 2014. There was a final rule in December 1st of 2015. EPA actually put forth the preview of the final rule in late September of 2015, which, if you remember, our NSPS JA dates was slightly before the JA compliance. So we were real thrilled to be dealing with two things at the same time at that point, trying to finish up the JA work while simultaneously realizing that we have another 3 years of this. A lot of real excited folks at plants realizing that they weren't done with their flaring. January 30th of 2019 was the final compliance date for MACT-CC. The MACT rules do allow for a 1 year, up to a 1 year extension. Many sites did request those, varying lengths up to a year. And we generally saw those being approved. So something to keep in mind of if you're at a site and for whatever reason, turnaround schedule, delays ordering instrumentation, you do have some wiggle room there, but it does rely on the agency to work with you. MACT-CC requirements, as I mentioned, it takes a lot of the Subpart A requirements, moves them into MACT-CC, establishes a couple of new operating limits, the net heating value and the combustion zone that we talked about already, and the net heating value dilution parameter, which is specific to air-assisted flares. So where the consent decrees had not really touched too much on air-assisted flares, there's very limited documentation in the CDs of the air-assisted flares, and where they do exist, rather than using a parameter like the dilution parameter, it talks about the stoichiometric ratio for air. And if you look across the literature, a lot of different numbers for that, and the EPA never seemed to settle on a value. So instead of incorporating that into the regulation, instead we got this net heating value dilution parameter for air assistance flares. Updates to the flare management plan. So again, these are refineries that generally speaking had prepared flare management plans under NSPS JA. So they were, although the rule doesn't say just update your FMP, no site that I'm aware of has 2 FMPs. Everybody took their existing FMP and updated it to make sure it would comply with both NSPS JA and MACT. MACT adds an additional plan, a continuous parameter monitoring system monitoring plan. I don't think EPA actually said the words without just using the acronym. We usually will just shorten it to CPMS plan. And this is a document that pulls together all the different details for the instrumentation, flow of event gas and steam, composition or net heating value monitoring, puts it all into one place. It has data management and the algorithms used to demonstrate compliance. And the rule also took a concept that we had seen previously and codified it as alternative means of emissions limitation, where if a flare is special, those of you who know Troy will be familiar with the phrase "every flare is a snowflake," and so everything's unique. And I think our experience kind of backs that up. Of every flare has something that makes it different than everything else we've ever seen. Some are more different than others. But the AML, alternative means of emissions limitation, allows for flares that maybe don't quite fit into the categories the EPA had thought of. Say, okay, that's fine, prove it, and it'll offer a different limitation. We've seen that in a couple sites. It was frequently used, of course, for multi-point ground flares, but we've also seen it in a couple sites being used for flexicoker, other sorts of flares that don't mean 270, but still be a good combustion.
So this act is for the existing players, right?
In the refinery sector, correct.
In the refinery, not in the plant.
Herman's going to talk more after I'm done about MACT and MON, which is the chemical sector.
So for a refinery existing player owned by MACT, stipulation you have to achieve 98% destruction efficiency. If you show that it actually does 99%, does it allow the option to be very important?
I mean, that's more of a question for the permitting or the agency of what they'll allow you to use. I know Texas has provisions for the lighter hydrocarbons, methane, ethane, propane, I think, are 99% destruction. And so the rule doesn't touch on that. The rule is, meet 270 and you're getting at least 98% destruction efficiency. That's really all.
It comes down a little bit to your permitting strategy.
Yeah.
So if you're wanting to claim a higher combustion efficiency when you're permitting, like a new unit or something like that, it's going to send material to the flare, and you don't want to trigger other PSV requirements or any kind of site-wide caps that you have. If you're going to say, well, I can reduce my emissions, the total emissions of the project, if I can have a higher combustion efficiency at the flare, but then it's again, you could have additional requirements on your flare. So usually it's just that minimum 98% is what you'll start out with, and just figure out, do we want to try to take a higher percent? Because it's like we're taking credit. There's no real good way, I would say, to parse it out when it's operational, to say, oh, now I'm meeting 98, now I'm meeting 99, because that would only really show up if you're reporting emissions.
I'm trying with the QOGI, if that helps.
Yeah.
Or if that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. There's no good way to prove it real time. Yeah. So I don't think anybody. So you permit it away, and then that's where sometimes people get in trouble. So again, you permit it at 99%, and they come in and ask for data, and then they say you weren't meeting 99, and now you've underreported your emissions by another %. Exactly. So it's just like a severity now. So it's because remember, when you're at 98 to 99, if you're at 98 and you go to 99, or 99, that's doubling your emissions. So I mean, it could impact that penalty phase.
The regulation doesn't have any correlation between 270 being 98, 350 being 99 or anything like that. The consent decrees, there is a calculation. No idea what how valid it is, but it is in the CDs.
We've also been in sessions. They were illogical. Where somebody was trying to do this, trying to convince whether they could be at 99% efficiency. There, and their urban engaged freaked out because they said you're producing more CO2. Oh, well, okay, so yes, but producing more CO2 is better than emitting more petrochemical, right? And so, I mean, push come to shove, it depends, you know, and right now, I mean, I believe that conversation happened because CO2 sequestration is a big focus right now on things when they said, okay, well, so actually, if you have a better combustion efficiency, you're producing more CO2, the permitting use. I don't, yeah, we don't understand why they didn't like that, but because they didn't like that. Yeah.
So one of the things, and I mentioned this a minute ago, that MACT also does, and EMACT and Bond are the same, is it severs the connection between refinery flares and the general provisions. So provided you are complying with the requirements of MACT or the RSR, you are no longer requirement to meet 60.18 or 6311. So that's not to say that you're relieved of those specific requirements that are in that regulation, because guess what? They're in MACT now. So so it does mean he relieves you of the requirement to meet both regulations. Does not generally, with one exception, relieve you of all those requirements.
And just a heads up is just because this regulation has removed that tie back to 60.18, that doesn't mean that you don't have a Title V permit with a state requirement that has written into it meet 300 in the vent gas. So I think that's been a difficulty where getting state requirements to match up with new federal requirements isn't always there. So you may end up having to meet both sets of requirements. I mean, meeting 270 versus 300, it's harder to meet 270, but you may have to still prove both for your permitting requirements.
Just a couple of definitions that are tweaked between NSPS JA and MACT. Under JA, we talk about flares, combustion device, uncontrolled volume of air. MACT adds that terminology Herman talked about earlier of lacking in enclosed combustion chamber. Ancillary equipment is one of the things that JA defines, referenced but not defined in MACT. So that's just in terms of what you're looking at from your minimization assessment. Ancillary equipment is one of the things that is listed. So MACT needs a little bit more open door of what could be included there. But JA has that specific definition. Assist air. So up until MACT was published, assist air was assist air. There was only one type of assist air, but MACT differentiated it into two different categories. Perimeter assist air which is what we would have traditionally always viewed as assist air, and then the other is premix assist air, which according to EPA is air that is added to the vent gas prior to the flare tip. So your John Zane folks can probably back me up on this. That doesn't really exist. Not at least in intentional injection.
It does in one location.
I might.
A technology called NSRS.
Okay.
Which was, luckily, it wasn't a very effective technology, so we killed it off. But the regulation was
Okay.
Yeah, so we got a whole detail and regulation around one flare.
But it was at a specific site that had a lot of attention.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's referenced in one of the consent decrees. So
It is.
I've heard of that.
So it needs to say, not really, it's just.
Yeah. So chances are none of your flares have, so don't worry about pre-mixes.
Yeah. Typically, we don't want to mix combustible material with air before you're in the combustion zone. So that's why they don't exist.
Well, yeah, I will say it worked well, but it didn't provide any benefit. So it didn't provide any benefit. It's like, yeah, the bolded underlined sections are kind of the big takeaways. The perimeter assist air, it's going to be something we come back to at the very end of this section. I did raise some questions regarding lower steam tubes and air that's entrained into those, but technical corrections to MACT kind of dealt with that. We'll talk about that. All of MACT's provisions are predicated on this idea of regulated material. MACT standards are generally focused on HAP reduction, so hazardous air pollutants, whereas the NSPS standards are focused on the criteria pollutants. So whereas JA was focused on sulfur, MACT is HAP focused. And so regulated material is any stream that is required to be controlled under the regulation. And there are a number of different HAP concentrations, depends on the source of the HAP and the material that we're looking at. Sometimes it's 5% HAP, other times it's 20 ppm. So it's a pretty big range of the types of material. Generally speaking, we assume flares in continuous service to always be receiving regulated material, because differentiating between which of these molecules came from which source is just not possible. So unless your flare has a water seal and is segregated from the rest of the flare header and is only receiving purge gas, either nitrogen or natural gas, we make the assumption that it's always receiving regulated material. So whether for flare gas recovery systems where they have that becomes a much more complicated thought process of when does compliance start, when does it end, and so that can be much more complicated. It's great to not be flaring all the time, but it does complicate your compliance approach, because your system, generally speaking, you're not going to know how long a flaring event is going to last. So even if you don't, the rule, and we're going to touch on it in a minute, has to be 15 minutes of flaring, and you don't necessarily know when an event starts that it's going to be 13 minutes, or it could be 16 minutes, or it could be 20. So you have to treat every event as if you have to meet the requirements. So it does mean you need a control system that will work very quickly to add the gas or keep your steam down to make sure you're meeting 270. Pilot flame monitoring. So this is one of those parts of the Subpart A requirements that EPA took from there, put it into MACT and added some clarifications. So pilot must be present at all times regulated material is sent to the flare. So technically, you don't have to have a pilot if you're only sending purge gas. I don't think any flare tries to turn a pilot on and off based on that understanding. One thing that MACT did, this is the clarification, the deviation is now any period greater than a minute without a pilot when regulated material is being sent to the flare for at least 15 minutes. So you need a minute of no pilot data. And so this comes down to how your data system is recording your pilot. If it's just pulling a random data point from that minute, whether it's good or bad, and saying that's my determination for that minute, or if it's taking more frequent measurements. All of this is important for making sure that if you have the opportunity to get a good data point, that you do get a good data point in that minute. Because if you don't have one, you're in a deviation. If you have a pilot outage that lasts for more than 15 minutes, if you have consecutive 15-minute blocks, those are separate deviations. It's not just a single deviation. You're starting to add the deviations on top of each other. And this does require continuous monitoring. The thermocouples, UV sensors, IR cameras are the most common that we see.
This means that if you have hydrocarbon layer for 15 minutes,
Regulated material.
regulated, and you have to have pilot for 1 minute.
Well, you have to have pilots for continuously, the whole 15 minutes. If you do not have pilot for 1 minute, within that 15-minute block, you have a deviation.
Yeah, so you capture every minute, you need at least one data point every minute, and then have them all be good. And then you get a good 15-minute block. So you're complying on the block. But it's sometimes, you know, 'cause before they added that change about the 1 minute, it was you must have a pilot at all times. Well, people are like, well, what's my deviation point? Is it a second? And I didn't have a signal for a second. Do we report that? And so they just clarified to say that, but we say, okay, sometimes data is lost or it's bad connection or whatever. So we say, if in that minute you got something that said good pilot, keep that data point because that'll keep your block good. But if it's, because we see some systems where it just grabs like the first second of every minute. And it's like, if that first second is bad, your whole 15 minutes is bad. So instead of having just that single grab is to grab a good point.
Players typically have more than one pilot, you can have.
Correct.
I was able to bring that up, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, so saying like most players have 3, if not 4, 5 pilots, depending on the size of the flare. You do have multiple pilots. You only need a signal from one in a traditional flare to comply with the regulation. Kind of keep that thought in your mind. Herman will come back to it a little bit later.
And if you don't have pilot, but you have a visible presence of plane, I know that.
Under MACT CC, no. Under EMACT and MON, maybe. So RSR is very specific of pilot flame monitoring. Under EMACT and MON, it's been expanded to be pilot/flare flame. So it's a gray area. I mean, I wouldn't, thermocouples or IR cameras are still the best option because they produce a very verifiable signal. Video cameras, questionable.
IR cameras from the pilot.
I think that's where the confusion came.
Yeah.
Because some people would say, I have an IR camera on for my pilots, and the EPA would say, well, are you seeing the pilot or the flare flame? And we say, what's the difference? Because either one is good, but they sometimes would question that. So I think the EMACT argued for that and got that allowance.
Either one's good, I would say main flame is better.
Well, yeah, main flame's better. The assumption is if your pilot is lit, the flare is lit. Yeah.
Or flare is lit, there's a pilot.
Yeah.
I don't need that pilot.
Yeah, it's like also, it's like, you know, you think about a thermocouple on a pilot, the flare flame is going to heat up that thermocouple just like the pilot flame would. So it's, you probably would have a good temperature reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can have a pilot that's off, flame engulfing the pilot, and the TC is probably gonna read below the
Threshold.
you're notified as pilot. Usually it goes off around the pilot.
You're seeing a pilot being locked in flame.
Right, because, well, at least with our pilots, I don't know about other technologies, but our thermal wells, our thermocouple thermal wells are cast down inside of our pilot hood. So they're to where the pilot flame attaches, it detects that temperature. But when the pilot outside is engulfed in flame, it's not really, it's having to transmit the heat through all that metal to get to the phone. So it does heat it up, but not.
Yeah, I not 800 or 1,000. There, it's really hot.
Yeah.
It's something.
Well, but it's on because it's protected, right? It's inside a bunch of metal.
It's not something.
Yeah.
Highways.
But the other option that you can throw out, I mean, you have an FMG line, acoustic monitoring is also.
Yeah, that acoustic monitoring can be installed while the flare's online. So similar to an IR camera, I mean, you don't have, there's no turnaround or hold the flare down, tip down and do anything. If that were to be a path. Also, I'd like to note how much time we just spent talking about pilots, and these are
You mentioned it, but the reality of it is without a pilot, you don't.
Sure, I mean, it's
So everything else, you.
also the most critical part of the whole thing, probably. All right, once again, after the pilot, we go to visible emissions. Under Subpart A, the limit was 5 minutes in any 2-hour period. Under MACT, the limit is still 5 minutes in any 2-hour period. But they've added some words. Wind regulated material is being sent to your flare. You would be hard pressed to smoke your flare if you're not sending regulated material to it. Natural gas doesn't tend to smoke, and nitrogen surely doesn't smoke. But they also added this last part about less than the smokeless capacity. So under Subpart A, it's just 5 minutes in a 2-hour block. That's it. Under MACT, we now have this idea of if the visible emissions limit applies when you are less than your smokeless capacity. That design smokeless capacity is typically from your flare vendors. The number that's specified during the design process for the flare. We did see sites during the MACT implementation phase where they had older flare, they couldn't find their documentation, so ultimately ended up assigning kind of their own smokeless capacity to it. Typically 10 to 20% of the total capacity of the flare was kind of about where the values we typically saw. But it also means that if you're operating above your smokeless capacity, so we've essentially stated that smokeless capacity is provided to EPA as part of the flare management plan. You've essentially stated that you expect to smoke above that. So it's not actually a deviation from this part of it. It does trigger a root cause analysis, but it's not necessarily a deviation of this requirement. The visible emissions do have two specific monitoring requirements now. Under Subpart A, it was all method 22. MACT has now added the allowance to use a video camera. That video camera is required to take an image of the flare at least once every 15 seconds and to be date and time stamped. The regulation requires that those images be kept for at least 3 years. Chances are your Title V will require them to be kept for 5. And so we're talking about 4 images a minute. We're talking thousands of images, millions of images even, in order to actually meet those data retention requirements. So it actually, the biggest part of this for the video surveillance option is data storage and the ability to actually, like, what software does your vendor provide to make reviewing the data or the images easier. And there are, I mean, lots of options in terms of the manufacturers of those video systems. I think what we have found is the biggest differentiation between them is their software, how easy it makes your life or the life of an environmental person on the back end for showing compliance. There is an initial method 22, the first time regulated material is sent to the flare. It's possible this has already been done for your flare. The EPA indicated that previously done initial determinations were acceptable. But if you don't have documentation of that or just want to be sure, going ahead and doing one is not the end of the world. After that initial, and that's a 2-hour period where you sit and stare at the flare with your 2 stopwatches. Method 22, if that is your compliance approach, requires daily 5-minute observations. Daily 5-minute observations start with, do I see any smoke, visible emissions? If you observe continuous visible emissions for more than a minute, you expand your observation period out to the full 2-hour period as previously specified. In addition to the daily that's required, you are also required to do an additional 5-minute observation period anytime visible emissions are observed from your flare. So do your daily, say at 8 a.m. You see anybody in the plant calls into the control room and says, hey, I see smoke from the flare at 10:30, start another one. 1:30, do another one. So this can be a very labor-intensive process for not a whole lot of results, particularly if you're not extending out the 2-hour period. So that's why, in our experience, I think we saw most people go with the video camera approach, just to save themselves the hassle of doing these daily observations and the subsequent ones during the day.
Yeah, but on that, when you're going out to that 2-hour period, once you see 5 minutes of smoke, you can stop
stop.
because you're reporting a deviation.
So if you're really smoking the flare, it may not actually be 2 hours, it could be 5 minutes. Pretty much touched on this. The output from the camera does need to be displayed in a continuously manned location. That can be the control room, that can be a security shack, where you've trained the security folks to look at it and keep an eye on it. I think generally speaking, control room is the most common approach to that because it's always manned. There's always somebody in there. So you can be sure that you're meeting that continuously manned requirement. The maximum allowed flare tip velocity, as Herman again discussed in the Subpart A requirements, these were implemented based on the results of testing in the 80s and concerns about liftoff and proper combustion at the flare tip. Substantial those concerns are is a matter of debate. But the limits in MACT still reflect those same limits we saw in Subpart A. Tip velocity is less than 60 feet per second, or it's less than 400 feet per second, and Vmax as calculated. See it. As calculated by this equation there, using the net heating value of the vent gas, which you're now going to be required to continuously monitor. You can calculate what your Vmax is. One big change from the Subpart A requirements into MACT is that units changed here in Subpart A, where they were using metric units, megajoules per cubic meter. Whereas here we've shifted to the more familiar units that we're used to talking about, BTU per feet per second. So that's just the calculation for that. As it turns out, if you use a net heating value of 300, that equation gives you 60. If you use a net heating value of 1,000, that equation gives you 400. So those are your endpoints, and then you have the flat lines on either side of those.
And 12 is interesting. I mean, that's the hydrogens.
It's a coincidence as best as we know, but yes, it's interesting.
Yeah, it threw us for a loop when it came out. We're like, what does it mean? What did they do? What did they change? Like, where did this come from? And then we're like, oh, they just changed the units. And it was just like, that's it. But yeah, because we all looked at that 12, we're like, did they do something for hydrogen? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was. We all thought about that. 850 is approximately methane.
Yeah.
Oh. So yeah, unusual. So flare tip velocity. This is actually one spot where EPA made a mistake in the original RSR, and in the calculation for tip velocity, it was stated that it's in actual rather than standard cubic feet. So this cum flow or quantity was stated to be actual, which caused quite a bit of concern among facilities figuring out. It's like, well, everything else we're going to talk about is in standard conditions. This is the one thing that was in actual. EPA later came back and said that was a mistake, our bad. Probably cost some people some money, but folks in the back are saving a lot of money. But mhm. So yeah, that was an unfortunate mistake on EPA's part, but I guess at least they fixed it. So yeah, this is a cumulative value over the 15-minute blocks. You only need to include the flow sent to the flare when there's regulated material. So if you have a flare gas recovery system and you are not sending it over the entirety of a 15-minute block, the rule does have some provisions that allow you to exclude some of that flow. This is the calculation. Another important data point, we mentioned the design smokeless capacity that you're going to get from your flare vendors. The unobstructed cross-sectional area of the flare tip is another data point that we look for from the flare manufacturers because their drawings are much more detailed and specific than the flare tip drawings that they provide you. So that's a value we usually look to get from them. We've gotten not terrible at estimating it, but their values are much better, much more precise. Yeah, and then standard cubic feet there is underlined just to emphasize this final version, not the one that was originally published. Your flow monitoring requirements. So similar to NSPS JA, we're going to have flow monitoring on the vent gas. MACT CC expands that requirement though to now we're monitoring the assist gas, whether it's steam or air, and potentially supplemental gas. So supplemental gas is a subset of the flare vent gas. Any monitoring on supplemental gas, if it is used for compliance purposes, is required to meet the same accuracy requirements as those for the flare vent gas. If supplemental gas is added upstream of the existing monitoring and you don't need to use it for any of your calculation purposes, those requirements go away because it's not compliant. One of the complicating factors in MACT CC that we've seen at sites cause some issues is that the rule defines standard conditions. Standard conditions are 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 1 atmosphere. Plants have generally been more used to using 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 1 atmosphere. So particularly the environmental folks, this doesn't usually bother, but once you get to talking to the engineers, this can come up as an issue. Particularly some sites have pointed out, and they're not wrong, steam does not exist at 68 degrees Fahrenheit and 1 atmosphere. Steam needs to be hot. It's going to be water at those conditions. However, in order to keep things consistent, and so we're comparing apples to apples rather than apples and oranges, everything is done at the same temperature and pressure.
Yeah, I've had multiple conversations with the engineer who is just cannot wrap their head around it. And I'm like, it is a mathematical audit. Like, it is not based in reality. It is just a mathematical construct to get everything to where they're comparing it. And they hate that. And I've had that conversation where I'm just like, it doesn't have to make sense. Just do it.
Was that a basis why you need to 60? Because it has science company 15C or 60.
I think I don't know exactly, but I think we thought it just had to do with where they were getting their data and how they picked some of their numbers. Is they were using a data source that had been done at 68, and so they set that. I don't know if it was anything beyond that.
There is an allowance for engineering calculations to be used for the vent gas, the flow rates. However, you need to know the molecular weight by compositional analysis at the location of monitoring in order to use this allowance. So for steam or air, it's a much more practical approach because those molecular weights are defined in the rule actually. For vent gas, it's much more complicated because the molecular weight from an ultrasonic flow meter cannot be used. It has to be from GC mass spec, something that's actually doing that compositional analysis. This is the calculation. You are allowed to use mass flow. So this is more relevant in the steam world. The ultrasonic meters are a volumetric measurement, as are the optical. So from a vent gas perspective, this does not come into play as much. But for steam, we do see mass flow meters used. So this is the calculation. That 385.3 is, again, where the standard conditions can come into play. We've seen lots of different values used there, but it's always different based on the standard conditions that the sites are familiar with using. So this is one spot where the calculations can get a little wonky at a site if things aren't matching up exactly. This is one place to look at in terms of to make sure that the right value is being used there for that molar volume conversion.
Did you say that ultrasonic flow meter is a molecular weight size?
Not for the engineering calc alternative. It has to be by compositional analysis. The molecular weight from the ultrasonic meter is based on the speed of sound and algorithms. So
Yeah, well, they tie it to a QA/QC analyzer for that metric. So you're not QA/QCing the molecular, the weight that comes off the ultrasonic flow meter, you're QA/QCing your analyzer. So the rule says you use the molecular weight from the device that meets the rule of the compositional analysis. It was specific in where you had to get it from.
So we have to have a CC or a calorie.
if you're using the engineering calculations.
Yeah, so if you're not using the engineering calculations, you don't need it.
Well,
I mean, everything,
for
all
this-
the calculations, which Derek will get into, are on a volumetric basis. So it's only if you're going from a mass flow meter to a volumetric flow meter that you would need the molecular weight. So again, it's typically only on a steam line or maybe a supplemental gas line where it comes to play.
But speaking of the following, we have getting one for it, it's active, that's have all the validate. Why is one?
It's just because that's how they wrote the
Yeah,
rule.
it's just the other words in the rule work
Yeah,
out.
yeah, the regulation says we can't do it, so we can't do it.
Next time we start with the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And why do we have to look into at the design stage, but we have to check it as already?
It's an option. It's not required. It's if you don't, for whatever reason, want to install a flow meter, or if you're using it on a steam line, it's a backup potentially to an existing flow meter of, you know, if you have to pull a flow meter to do maintenance on it, maybe you can use your valve calculations and existing temperature and pressure to get, you know, that way, at the very least, you can control your flare appropriately while the flow meter's out.
Yeah, we see the,
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, if the temperature and pressure monitoring is still there, it's that.
yeah, that engineering calc is mostly used if it's like a purge gas connection where you have an orifice.
Yeah.
And it's just because they just want to be able to say, you don't need to put a flow meter on your purge gas line. You can use the orifice calc. But just remember, it's temperature and pressure monitoring with the engineering calc. So sometimes it's like you have a pressure on your purge gas line and an orifice plate, but you don't have the temperature. So then it again, you may end up adding a temperature monitor where you don't really need it other than proving this calc out.
Unless you use the worst case scenario, and the lowest case one.
Yeah, I mean, it'd only be if you get I'd say more, it's like the conservative answer is have the monitor. If you want to go like with a worst case estimate, I mean, you would just have to prove that when EPA comes and says you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
So that's your flow monitoring requirement. The next monitoring point is the net heating value. The rule provides 4 different options for how to determine this. One is composition monitoring, so GC, mass spec. One is a calorimeter. One is a calorimeter with a hydrogen analyzer. Then grab samples are also allowed. So composition monitoring is not required for pipeline quality natural gas, or the rule also has a section that allows for sampling over the course of 7 to 14 days to demonstrate a consistent net heating value for a given flare. So if you have a flare in, say, rail car service or a tank farm where it's getting a pretty consistent flow of gas, you know, that sort of thing could potentially be an option. And what you do is you take that sampling and you pretty much just take the lowest value you record, and you assume that value at all times and comply with it for your flare. That's very rare.
Yeah, and I would say you have to also consider the scenarios.
Yeah.
So if that stream will ever see a maintenance flow where you're nitrogen purging out something or steaming something out, that's your low case BTU case. You can't just say, I'm going to use this one and then use that one. No, you have to go with that ultra low number. So you could have this really low number and that doesn't help you out. So.
Just going to point out the 3 flares shown here. One of them's doing okay. But no, that's what we're trying to get away from, is the big steam plumes. Move more towards that bright luminous flame. The calculations as defined in the rule. Or if you're using the composition monitoring, the rule table 12 of the rule specifies the net heating value to be used in that calculation. This is going to come back into play when we start talking about some of the QA/QC requirements on the gas cylinders that are used for these instruments. They are allowed to certify, the vendors can certify the heat content of their cylinder. You want to make sure that they're using table 12 from the regulation rather than their own documentation, because one of the things we've seen is that the Cylinder Gas Association has different values, presumably because they're at different standard conditions is my best guess, but they don't match exactly. So if you follow the rule to the letter, you want to make sure that the gas vendors are using table 12. And for the most part, air gas, air heat, et cetera, they all know this, they've been through it, so shouldn't be a problem. Calorimeter, if you have only a calorimeter, the net heating value is what you measured. It is the output from the instrument with no adjustments. If you have a calorimeter plus the hydrogen analyzer, so this equation comes in where we're taking the measured value and adjusting based on that hydrogen composition. This is obviously a pretty big boost if you have high hydrogen. Without it, hydrogen can have a heating value of 274 BTU per scuff. So you're adding up that 938 BTUs for every mole percent of hydrogen in your gas. And that note at the bottom, refiners can use 1212 BTU per scuff for hydrogen. Obviously, that is now also expanded to EMACT and MON once they're in compliance with this rule. The operating limits. So here, these are the new provisions that MACT added. One is 270 BTU per scuff in the combustion zone. And this applies to all flares, whether you are unassisted, steam assisted, or air assisted. All flares are subject to this. So that is on a 15-minute block basis. When regulated material is sent to the flare for 15 minutes. One of the things EMACT and MON have done is they've clarified when when those 15 minutes apply and which blocks need to comply and which ones don't. MACT does not have those provisions currently. So while we have some guidance on where EPA is kind of thinking on that, it's not codified in the rule officially. And then I mentioned earlier, the biggest addition that we saw to the flare operating limits under MACT-CC is probably this dilution parameter, which requires air-assisted flares or air receiving perimeter assisted air to maintain 22 BTU per square foot. So it's kind of the flux of BTUs out through the flare tip. We'll see here in a minute how that's calculated a little differently than NHVCZ. And so if you have only a steam-assisted flare, it's only the top one. But air-assisted flares are required to meet both, and there are certain operating conditions where one can be in compliance and one can't be. And so it's you have to do it.
Isn't that the air gas is automatically because the air gas has to be 300 volts?
Say again, sorry.
So the air gas
Mhm.
in the air has to be 300.
Yeah, well, not even. So 300 BTU per scuff under MACT-CC is gone away, except unless you have a Title V permit that says thou shalt comply with 60.18 or 6311. So the scenarios where you would be meeting 270 or 22 BTU per square foot and not meeting 300, I think are very limited. But yeah, so you're by and large almost always going to be at least 300 on that.
I thought that 300 was the requirement.
Well, and HRVOC is still going to require 300 until it changes. So that's, I'm sure that's part of what you're thinking about is HRVOC will still need 300. But you'll be monitoring for it. So there's really nothing, there's likely nothing you're going to need to change for it. Calculation methods, the rule does prescribe two different approaches for calculating your net heating value in the combustion zone and the net heating value dilution parameter. One is the direct calculation method and the other is the forward approach. Demonstrate these here in a minute. By and large, I don't know of a facility that went with feed forward. So I think almost everybody did direct. Feed forward, as shown here, it's taking a measurement, and it's kind of done with an idea towards recognizing that GCs have a lag between when they take a sample, when they report a sample, and when you can apply that sample. And so EPA was trying to work within the technology as they understood it at the time. I think feed forward was an attempt to build in some flexibility. All it really did ultimately was complicate it, and nobody needs it. But as we show here, the yellow is one sample, blue is next, so on. So where the first sample is taken, applied both to this first 15-minute block and the second one, and the third one, because our next sample is being reported here. So as the sample is reported, it's applied forward to the next block, and so on, trying to anticipate what's going to the flare. As I said, nobody did this. It's too complicated. The sites at this point have just gone with the direct calculation of taking the measurements you're getting, trying to comply as you know, as they come to you. The net heat value combustion zone parameter is designed to take into effect the dilution of the combustion zone gas by the assist steam or the assist air. This was a parameter we first saw in all those consent decrees. The big difference between what we saw in the consent decrees and what we saw now in MACT-CC is MACT-CC set a static limit. The old consent decrees, Marathon, BP, Shell Deer Park, I think too, all had a variable NHVCZ based on you know, hydrogen content, olefins, and it was all very complicated. So you didn't have a 270 number to hit. It was whatever the conditions in your flare dictated. So EPA pulled all of that out, and now we just have a static limit for 270. One of the other differences in terms of, I mean, it ultimately doesn't affect the numbers, but in the consent decrees, EPA was specifying values on a mass basis. MACT-CC does operate on a volumetric basis. So if you were to go back and look at some of the older consent decrees, the Q terms here are instead a mass flow divided by molecular weight in most cases. It's the same number, it all works out, but just know that the calculations will look different. So the first one is the direct calculation method, and the second is the feed forward. As you can see, it's just direct is much more simple. Feed forward approach requires you to know the amount of supplemental gas you're adding, both in the current block and in the next one, and then trying to adjust based on that for the next block. Whereas the direct approach, you just need to know your cumulative volumes from the previous 15-minute block and apply it and calculate it, and that's your value for that block. We talked about the premix assist air earlier. That term goes to zero. It's in there because it's in the rule, but it always goes to zero. This is the net heat value dilution parameter calculation. Big difference between NHVCZ and NHVDIL is this diameter term in the numerator. That's the effective diameter of your flare tip, that unobstructed cross-sectional area, factored down into a diameter. That's, you know, as we talked about, it's kind of that flux of BTUs up through the tip. And so you want to know how much, how many of those, how much flux you're getting through that area. The QA perimeter term here, the other big difference, the steam does impact this quantity as well, but the assist air will generally be the dominant term there. 2018 technical corrections. I've touched on a couple of these already, but EPA made some mistakes. So one of the things that we started realizing as we read the rule and looked at the definitions and the rest of the regulation was that based on the definitions EPA had provided to us, lower steam tubes, as we kind of see here, have a steam injector on within the shroud. And it pulls ambient air into the steam tube and then it injects it into the middle of the combustion zone up here. And so based on the definitions of perimeter assist air in the regulation, it was air that was conveyed via hard piping to the combustion zone. That air suddenly seemed to meet the definition of what perimeter assist air was. And so EPA listened, I think some of the manufacturers spoke to them. What was ultimately determined was that the air in those lower steam tubes was not sufficient to impact that heating value of the combustion zone, create new non-compliance issues, except when you had an effective diameter of the flare tip of less than 9 inches. As far as I know, those flares don't exist. So I've never run across a flare where this has been an actual concern, but there was a period of time where we were trying to figure out how all of this was going to work together. If a flare were to exist that would under that 9-inch threshold, it would be required to comply with an HVDIL and an HVCT, and that would be based on an estimate of the air being pulled in by those steam tubes using the maximum air steam ratio. But again, these don't seem to exist, so probably not an issue. Emergency flaring provision. This is where EPA has inserted the new requirements to prepare a flare management plan. If a flare has the potential to operate above its smokeless capacity, which again is pretty much all flares, a flare management plan is required. However, you do have that unicorn flare that for whatever reason can't operate above its smokeless capacity. An FMP is not actually required. That's where all the FMP and root cause analysis thresholds are. It's under these emergency flaring provisions. The FMP requirements in MACT are very similar to what we saw in NSPS although there are differences. EPA seemed to learn some things in the process, pulled some things out and said that that's not important, and added some other things in that they decided were. One of them is that design smokeless capacity that we talked about. This isn't a term that's defined in the rule, but it is a single value. So you're required to set one number to apply to a flare that sees all manner of different operating conditions, which can be very complicated and concerning to some sites. And so there's no sliding scale allowance. We all understand that vent gas flow, vent gas composition, the availability of steam, resist air, all of these can impact when your flare will actually smoke. But under the rule, the FMP is one value only. PRD prevention measures, so pressure relief devices. PRDs that are routed to a flare are exempt from some of the requirements for PRDs in MACT-CC. MACT-CC is not just the flare rule. There are lots of other provisions in it related to PRDs, tanks, etc. So this is one section where those PRDs that are routed to the flare don't have to comply. However, in the minimization assessment section of MACT-CC, it does specify that you need to have a list of all your PRDs that go to the flare. And as part of that list, a documentation of the prevention measures that are installed. And additionally, for the minimization assessment, you have to assess whether additional prevention measures are necessary on those PRDs. So that's where, although they are exempt from the requirements to have them, you're still required to consider them under MACT-CC. That list of PRDs also requires some documentation in terms of size and set point of each of these PRDs. What we have found in a lot of sites is that information exists in different places, but does not generally exist all in one place. So that's usually a challenge to either build that list or get the right people together to say, this is where it all is. It's not something that gets submitted to the agency, but if you were to be inspected, it's a low-hanging fruit that an inspector could say, show me your PRD list. You want to be able to do that quickly and easily. Root cause analysis. So the MACT-CC has two provisions that can trigger a root cause analysis. Both are predicated on the fact that you have to exceed your smokeless capacity. One is that visible emission, you've exceeded your smokeless capacity and you have visible emissions for 5 minutes in a 2-hour period. And the other is you've exceeded the smokeless capacity and your 15-minute block average tip velocity is greater than either 60 feet per second or whatever your calculated Vmax is. So either of those can trigger the need to do a root cause analysis. The requirements for that root cause analysis are very similar to what is in JA. Subsequently require corrective action. But the big change in the RCA is, whereas JA did not have any consequences to your root cause analysis, at least not directly in the rule, MACT-CC adds some teeth. MACT-CC specifically defines what constitutes a violation based on the number of root cause analyses you're dealing with. So any flow event which is related to either operator error or poor maintenance is automatically a violation. And then you have different levels of 2 from a single flare in a 3-year period, or 3 in single flare for any reason, 3-year period. So 2 is for same root cause, 3 is for any reason. So any of those can trigger a violation. When triggering a violation, NOV, you have the possibility for enforcement. Alternative means of emissions limitation. We talked about this earlier. I'll spend too much time here. CTMS monitoring requirements. So most of what we have talked about thus far has been in 63.670, part of the rule. CTMS requirements are in 63.671. And that deals with specific operational requirements for all the instrumentation that we've put into compliance. Table 13 of the regulation specifies accuracy as well as general preventative maintenance for each of these instruments. It establishes some other values, some other requirements. The instrumentation is required to complete one analytical cycle at least once every 15 minutes. So that's our definition of continuous under the regulation. The exception of pilots, which is once per minute. The 63.671 also defines control periods, ways to reduce the data, and just general installation requirements for the instrumentation. One of the things that the out of control periods as defined in the regulation are very specific to actually the composition analyzers. So low level, mid level, or high level calibration exceeds 2 times the accuracy requirements of the regulation. We don't do low level, mid level, or high level calibrations for flow meters or pilots or visible emissions cameras. So really the only thing that can be out of control under the regulation is actually a GC or a mass spec that's doing those specific QA/QC checks. Have an out of control period starts the hour that you noticed it, and it ends the hour that you perform the corrective action and recalibrate it to show you we're back in its good graces. CTMS monitoring plan. This is, again, the added document that's going to pull together all the instrumentation, pilot, visible emissions, flow, composition, and heating value into one place. This is not submitted to the agency unless they request it. But again, similar to the PRD list, you want to have it on site readily available because it's a low-hanging fruit that can be asked for in the event of inspection. Record keeping and reporting. The next few slides are going to go through all the different records that have to be kept, as well as what needs to actually be reported to the agency. In addition to what we're going to talk about in the next few slides, you want to keep a copy of your FMP, copy of your CTMS plan, any RCA reports, and that PRD list that we talked about. So pilot monitoring, you're required to keep an output of a monitoring device showing the pilot is present. That data is not required to be the 1-minute data. If you have 15 minutes in a block that all show good value, that can be reduced down to a single data point. However, once you have that 1 minute, then you have to keep of no pilot. You have to keep that data, and that is also reportable. Visible emissions. We touched on this. If you do the camera, it's a 3-year retention period under the rule, but it's a 5-year retention period, probably under your Title V. Then records of any visible observations you may do under Method 22. Only reportable thing there is if you do have a 5-minute event in a 2-hour period, that's reported to the agency. For flow monitoring, we're recording all of the data because ultimately we want to be able to back up whatever our NHBCZ or NHB deal calculations are to show how we got that number. If you're doing composition modeling, you are required to keep records of individual component concentrations from each analysis for 2 years. That includes hydrogen analyzers installed on calorimeters. That is composition monitoring that will fall under that. So make sure you're keeping the right data from your instrumentation to meet that requirement. So the records of each 15-minute block period, you are not required to submit all of that data. But when you have a period when one or more of the operating parameters are out of compliance, that does become a reportable incident. I don't think we included it actually in the next section, but there is an error in EMACT that makes those not reportable. So we would expect that to be fixed. But as it stands right now, EMACT does not require those provisions to be reported, which seems like a clear error. So we would expect that to change. You are not required to report downtime of your instrumentation. You are required to maintain records of it, but that is not reported to EPA. This is another change under EMACT and bond where they both have downtime reporting. Just more documentation. One of the things that the rule does want to see is periods when there is no regulated material going to the flare, which would really just be either if you have a water seal, when the water seal is intact, and you're only sending purge or to purge to the flare, as well as periods when the flare exceeds the smokeless capacity, regardless of whether you actually smoke the flare or not during that period. You're going to keep root cause analysis and corrective actions, and a implementation schedule that may have resulted from those. That.
All right, we only got like 10 more slides to go, and we have like 17 minutes. So to stay on time, we'll just keep moving. But if after we finish up our time, I don't think anybody's in this room. So if anybody wants to stick around and more conversations, we can do that. But in case somebody has to go do something at 11, we will keep moving. Okay, so EPA decided to push out 3 rules in a very short time frame. So you can see here, they published the EMACT July 6, 2020, OLD MACT the very next day, July 7, 2020, and then the bond rule they published on August 12, 2020. So I mean, in very short order, they decided to push out these rules. This pulls in various units from the chemical side, but kind of everybody needs to know which rules that applies to them. But again, and the 3-year compliance window stands for all of them. So we are within that 3-year period for all of them.
There's some nice sense of people call that as an old Mac.
Yes. Oh, yes.
What happened to them? And then I say organic.
Yeah. Organic liquids distribution. We love acronyms in environmental. We love acronyms. So, Yeah. So there's no new Mac, there's only an old Mac. Yeah. Okay, so one of the biggest things I think Derek already said was all like the EPA said we're gonna phone it in when we're doing all the regulatory language. So instead of actually picking all those requirements that were in RSR and putting them into these rules, all they did was say, hey, go follow the rules in RSR. So literally you got a pushback to RSR. They did make some changes, but they did not take the time to put all of those requirements of 670 and 671 into these regulations. So I'm just going to cover a couple of the big differences here. The old MAC, one of the big things they found because the EPA, when they're making these rules, they do collection requests. They take that data that they get and they set their rules. And so when they did the OLD MAC, they did not expect any of these flares to basically need smoke. So they basically said, you don't smoke, you don't need an FM. You don't need the emergency flaring provisions, so you don't need an FMP. You still need a CPMS plan. So, well, no FMP, you still got to do CPMS. This is one that was interesting. This is one of the first ones where they further reduced the flares that were subject within the subset. So, under the refinery rule, it was just if you go off a flare in refinery service, you had to have it applied. Under the MON, MON is miscellaneous organic niche. I mean, there's all kinds of chemicals going on in there. And they restricted to say only flares that are dealing with olefins and polyolefins. And when that first came out, they did not define olefin or polyolefin. We were just like, what does that extend to? I mean, people make polyolefins out of all kinds of stuff. I mean, that's not just the ones. So that was brought up to the EPA, and EPA clarified. So ethylene polyethylene, propylene, polypropylene, that's it. So that got a lot of flares out. And I specifically, I was talking to the EPA and I asked them, I said, why do you do that way? Just so we understand. And they said, when we looked at the industry, those were the biggest flares. So they basically said we wanted to regulate the larger flares. We didn't want to regulate these small flares. They basically said, you know, they're small flares. They don't have a lot of emissions. We don't feel like they need to put all this control onto these smaller flares that don't have as much emissions. So they said, we're going to go after the big ones and leave it at that. They also included flares that used to treat for ethylene oxide. So that was another thing that was pulled in. I think that had to do with all those ETO sites getting into the news. They decided they needed to have a regulation to address that. Basically, they kept all the requirements the same because they said ETO is more combustible than ethylene. So if this works for ethylene, it's going to work for ETO. So they did not change any requirements for ethylene oxide, but they did say in ethylene oxide service you have to comply. But then we would say, as they're saying, you know, the record keeping and reporting requirements are slightly, just, you know, ever so slightly tweaked. So again, always check those regulations to make sure that you're doing everything as necessary. So as I said, we're following 670 and 671. But then of course, you know, we talked about, we had this slide on the AMACT and, you know, talking about if your flare, you know, a multi-point ground flare that's pressure assisted cannot meet the exit velocity requirements of the rules. Sonic velocity, so it cannot. But they know, the EPA knew, they've been getting these emails from the refining sector saying, I want to use this flare, and look, we have test data, it shows that it's great. And they had to ask for these emails. And basically the EPA was like, we're tired of getting all these emails. We know that it's okay. So what they did was they put an allowance for multi-point ground flares into the regulation. And so, because they basically said, we don't want to have to approve any more AMAC. And we actually know sites that submitted AMLs and had their AMLs rejected because the EPA said, we're going to deal with this regulation. We don't want to have to take the time to review your AML, so just wait. So that did happen. Pilot planes, same, pretty much everything's the same. Again, I'm saying with clarification, this is mostly on the ground flares. Visible emissions, you know, it's pretty much all the same. Exit velocity, again, these ground flares are bringing in all these new requirements. But again, the combustion operating limits is new for the industry, but then again, with the multi-point ground flares, there's a new number. So we have even more things to think about. What are the other big items? Derek brought up those RCA triggers. Remember, it was exceeding your smokeless capacity and having an exit velocity requirement. Exceeding your smokeless capacity and having a visible emissions exceedance. When the EPA was reviewing all the data that they collected for when they were doing the rulemaking for the EMAC and MON, they looked at the industry and they basically did not have data that I think somebody actually commented to remove it. They were going to have an RCA trigger for the velocity exceedance, but they said the data provided, no flare showed data that you provided indicated that none of the flares would exceed the velocity requirement. So they said we don't have to include that in the rulemaking. So they took that away. So now you only have an RCA requirement for exceeding your smokeless capacity and having a visible emissions exceedance. And since that time, I've had conversations with the EPA saying there are flares that are going to exceed the exit velocity requirements at these facilities that are not pressure resistant flares. And they're like, we didn't know that. So we didn't know it, so we couldn't write a rule that included it.
So they were trying to think we're removing some regulatory, it's like one of those things, if we can make the regulation less, have less words, that's helping keep people out, but it's kind of like they took away. And why did they put in these RCA requirements into the rule? It was basically because people said, how am I going to, have this smokeless capacity? And in an emergency situation, if I can't exceed my exit velocity during an emergency quick operation, I have to put in like 4 more flares. And I'm going to have all these flares, burning purge gas, burning pilot gas, and they're going to go off once every 5 years. But in order to meet this requirement, that's what I'm going to have to do. And EPA said, we don't want more flares. EPA basically said, we don't want, they don't really like flares. And they basically said, we don't want more flares. So we don't, so that's why they put in these RCAs to say, you're not going to have a violation, but you got to do a root cause analysis and do all of this stuff. So it was kind of a way to not build a whole bunch of new flares. Well, we'll see how, if this actually comes to be something that is going to affect people and cause some problems in the future. But I mean, I've heard nothing to say that they're looking to change the regulation to add that accommodation back in.
All flares, at some point of time, really exceeded this whole distance. 20-30% of the flares for the max capacity. And then once if it's an emergency flare, it's going to exceed that. That's the thing that they have to really discuss at that point.
Yeah. So if you see your RCA, or if you receive, you've got to think of it as like your smokeless capacity is below that number. If you're operating it correctly, you should not smoke. So if you exceed that value, then you're likely to smoke. And once you've smoked over 5 minutes, now you got to do a root cause analysis. It's not going straight to you violated the standard. It's hitting you with a work practice standard.
At some point, that steam access to the air is
Correct.
Especially when you say that, I'm not working it's just the equipment is not designed.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, so every flare has a smokeless capacity. So I mean, you're going to reach a point where you will smoke.
And at that point, this could trigger.
Yeah. And then, they want to make it so that it's exceeding your smoke capacity. They say, everybody said, well, that's only upset. That's not, so it's like, you shouldn't be upsetting all the time if you're doing good maintenance. It's one of those things where they trap you and they say, you shouldn't be upsetting all the time if you're doing all your maintenance and all, keeping everything up to date, operating it well. This should be a rare occurrence. And that's where they added those things to say, you only get like 3 for any reason in a 3-year period. Basically saying they don't want you to they don't want you to do this all the time, right? Because they want you to design your system to meet the requirement. If you're going to go there all the time, you're going to play. But if they want you to try to tighten that operation down to not do it. So multi-point ground flares. This was something that was a little bit in the refining sector, I would say. I say much bigger in the ethylene, polyethylene sector. They knew about it. We had the A-mails. They wanted to get rid of the A-mails. So they came out and said, we're going to have a general allowance. So that's a good thing that we don't have to now write A-mails, but with anything, there's good and the bad. And, one of the things, it's just as this is the regulatory requirement for a ground flare does not mean this is the design criteria for your ground flare. So work with your manufacturers get your flare designed as appropriate. But they wanted to give some numbers. So if you're going to use the multi-point ground flare, you got to think of that as a flare with the burners, like that first picture I showed you, where you have the runner with the little, like they look kind of like tulip bulbs popping down the line. And so you have pilots, and they one lights off the other, so they're sliding across the road. And so that was with a lot of the testing that was done to show that these ground flares meet the requirements was making sure you have good cross lighting. If you don't have good cross lighting, you have two burners that aren't burning, and now you have a lot of emissions, and you're not going to meet your destruction efficiency. So it really had a lot to do with that cross lighting. So the number they came down to was 800. If you saw a lot of the emails, that number was common in a lot of them. There were differences. There were numbers that were lower. But, you know, that 800 number was pretty consistent. They basically said you can't use the feed forward value. You got to use the direct calculation method. Like I said, you must have two continuously lit pilot plants. We're going to talk a little bit about this on another slide, but you got each stage has to have two pilots. The distance, again, thinking about that cross light, they set a maximum distance between the burners, 6 feet from center to center. Whether that's the appropriate spacing for your ground flare, I would say that needs to come from the design. But again, if you're going to go beyond 6 feet, you're going to have to probably add more pilots. Also, you have to, again, for the documentation, because typically you don't have a flow meter on every stage. You have a single flow meter on the header. In order to know which stages are lighting off, you have, pressure monitoring and then valving that opens up the stages based off that pressure staging. So you'll, pressure up, stage opens, pressure will drop a little bit. If it keeps going up, hits that pressure threshold, another stage opens up, and you keep opening up stages to deal with the event. And then as the pressure comes down, they destage and close off. So so you need to have that data from the valve position, like if it's open or closed, and the pressure in the header. So typically that is included with your flare packet. So it's not like it's something new, but just remember that you're going to need to keep that data for your record. This was something that came up, and again, it came down to what the EPA know. It's a multi-point ground flare that can operate in multiple regimes. So, if your first stage typically operates in a below 400 feet per second, you would say, well, that's a normal flare. I'm complying with the normal standard. I'll meet 270. But when we pressure up, it will get to a point where all of a sudden that stage becomes a pressure assist flare, and then I'll want to comply with 800. And so that's not specifically stated in the rule as such. So of course we made the anonymous question to EPA, and the EPA was like, we did not know that a multi-point ground flare could operate not pressure assisted. So they did not, they indicated that they were not likely to allow a flare to operate and comply with two different compliance points at the same time. Of course, I was being slightly vague because the client that I was helping did not want their name to come up at this point of the discussion. And so, EPA kind of said, you would have to provide a lot more information on the flare types of flows, compositions, and how we would know that you would still be able to meet all the requirements when you want to be in this 270 zone. Because again, and this comes into our next question is this pilot lighting. So they, because when this was and this is in the EPA response to comments to the email. So when a rule comes out, anybody can comment, submit a comment, and the EPA responds. And so they had questions about the piloting of these multi-point ground flares, and having these low pressure flares, and using this 2 pilot per stage approach. And the EPA, I highlighted some words just to say they had particular technical concerns about the cross-lighting of a flare at a low BTU value, because that's what And in my mind, I'm thinking that's what they saw when they saw the testing that was done for these A-males was they needed to have a sufficiently high net heating value for the cross-lighting. So now in their minds, they're saying, wait, you want to be at 270 and have cross-lighting? We don't know that that's going to work. And so they basically didn't agree with that. Or again, it's what data do they have to make this basis on? And then they say, again, and they clarified, and they said this, which was, again, flagged lots of concerns in my mind, was we have always required that a flare must have a continuously high flame, and that each burner on a multi-point flare that is not pressure assisted is considered a flare in itself, and each burner must operate with a pilot flame or flare flame. And I knew of 2 flares that operate non-pressure assistedly that do not have a pilot on every single burner. And I said, oh no, this is, because we always said the rules, remember how the rules were written? And they didn't have these in mind, of course. The rules were written to say a flare must have a pilot light. Well, we always said a flare is within this zone, or if it's a multi-point flare, it's usually like if it's an enclosed flare, it's got a shroud. That is a flare. That is permitted as a single flare. Now they're trying, and so we would say there are pilots in the flare. Usually they're on each runner. And we're like, so it's got a pilot, it's gonna light off. And now we're being told, oh no, those flares aren't meeting the pilot requirement, and they clarified to say we have never, or we have always required this. And I just think to myself, and again, because this was part of my conversation with the EPA, is they're like, we had no idea this was out there. I'm like, well, it's kind of old flares. It's not typical, but it exists. And yet again, it was a mismatch. So again, you look at what is the requirement. And so I'll say, at least from the newer designed multi-point ground flares, and a lot of times they'll have that first stage have a low pressure setting, and they'll have steam on that stage to deal with the smoke. The newer designs, I mean, the ones that I've been reviewing, each one of those steam assisted ones has its own pilot on it. I mean, those are, so like in that term, it's not a problem. They've got a pilot light on every single burner, so that's not a problem. So we have this, so, it's some of these older designs that maybe weren't considering this, thinking that they had sufficient piloting, that now come into question. So if you have this flare that's not going to go pressure assisted, or are you going to now try and call it a pressure assisted flare to get above 800 now instead of 270? That's a lot of extra gas for no real benefit. But some of these flares have many, many, many burners. And are you going to put in 20, 30, 40 pilots into this enclosed flare in order to get every burner piloted? I mean, a lot of times that's not going to be even feasible with the space to get all that piping in there. Plus, all that added pilot gas. And then one thing that, again, my mind triggered was, and again, I like to think about these words. What are the words that EPA use? And so they use the word burner. And I say to myself, okay, burner is not defined. What do you consider a burner? And so, and then also, they never, did they say, they don't, this bus lighting phenomenon is what you're counting on with the pressure flare. And so my mind started thinking, well, we have these great big tips that are low steam usage tips by multiple manufacturers that have where the vent gas goes up the stack and then splits into various modules for combustion to get lower steam usage for the combustion. you know, are, my question is, and, you know, and I don't know the answer. So this is one of these things where I'm just bringing up the question to either, you know, have people either think about this, maybe the EPA needs to be consulted, or maybe you just need to know your strategy in case the question ever gets raised at your site, so you don't say the wrong thing. Have your things to say. But it's like, is the flare like a multi-tip, non-pressure assisted flare? Is that the flare? Is that the burner? As opposed to each individual one being the burner? Because not all the time, especially if you get to what, like, you know, a lot of these separate modules, they're not always individually piloted. And that hasn't been the industry standard because they found that they don't need them. So why would you have all these extra pilots if you don't need it for the operation of the flare?
So a pilot for each of those arms individually, and then will review.
See, that's the question, is whether or not they need a pilot or not. You know, whether or not it's gonna light off on its own. Because also, you know, you think about a multi-point ground flare, you know, that distance they were talking about is 6 feet. You know, these larger flares, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, are, you know, within a foot to a foot and a half.
Yeah, I mean, they're maybe 6 inches apart.
Yeah, so I mean, the distance between these air quoting here, the recording picks me up. I'm air quoting burner.
Yeah.
You know, it's you know, whether or not somebody would think that this is, each one of those is a burner as opposed to the whole color being a burner. That's where I feel like there's that needing to have that response, or that say, well, I interpreted this to be, because each stage, they all work together. They don't, you're not staging them in and out. No. So I mean, they're all getting vent gas uniformly, I'm assuming. So I mean, they're all, you know, kind of working together. They're getting the gas and they're lighting up.
And at some point, you could become one arm like another. I didn't do that. It's just from side to side.
Well, so he's talking about some different technology. There's two out there. We do the XP.
No, we talk about
No, he's talking about the Ethylene.
we're talking about maybe that's what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need my picture.
Yeah, no, what he's talking about, the concern is, you know, because.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm talking about
Ground.
first stage, which is the low pressure stage, needs these 500 bars. That was like
That's the assumption, yes.
next easy.
Yeah. Well, that's what he's just saying, there's a concern in the wording of that response. Raise that question.
Yeah, there came to a place where if a person is not educated in how these work, you know, regulators, they don't know about this stuff. I mean, they didn't know that these flares could experience these different flows. You know, they're not keeping up with all these unique.
And what I would say is in that situation, but we do have documented data that proves that those elevated flares. We also have documented data that proves it for the multiple points.
So in this case, I thought we are talking about multi-point ground flares and pipe sources, which has a non-pressure assist or have a non.
Well, yeah, we're moving from one to another. So the first quest is here, is the multi-point ground flares where they have different stages. And you see that when there's a steam assist row, that with the newer designs we see, each of those burners have a pilot.
Okay. I missed that, this section actually talks about regulated design.
Yes. Yeah, because most steam use it elevated technology. And so that's where we've seen that they don't, when you get them a greater number of those modules,
but they don't always have a pilot on every module. So if this is where, just because the EPA used that word burner, would they consider each one a burner or the whole thing a burner? And so that's where I think people just need to be prepared. It's like one of those things, it's like we get so far in the weeds that we think about this stuff. You know, the regulator is going to be pretty far away from this point, but it could come up. They're like, hey, that looks interesting. Does it, where's the pilots? And they say, oh, we got pilots. And they show them and they're like, but there's not a pilot on every one. And you gotta be prepared with that answer to say, no, it's one burner.
Yeah.
Many times they're not having, but it's not.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you said that, so this thing is already very bad, but this was only game or something.
No. Yeah, I don't think it's been brought up,
Yeah.
right? He's just saying,
It could be.
we see this, if the question comes up, we should be prepared for a response.
Correct.
And you say, that's,
Yeah, we can,
oh, we have.
Yeah. And, you know, I was already informed, I think that we have test results that show, ignition, and actually, so we had a 6 module, we did 6, 3, 2. Yeah, basically got down to 2 pilots on the whole thing, but it showed that, as long as you have a module next to a piloted module, everything's fine. Right, so you can go as far as to say piloted, unpiloted, unpiloted, piloted.
That's what we do.
Yep, and so even the largest XP design that we have, I can't speak for the other designs, but the largest that we have is a 6, which is a 12 module, and requires compliance.
Back to non-personal aspect, groundwater,
Yes.
individual partners, individual partners. Do they need to say like, 270, 18% the addition?
So based on my conversation, unless that stage kind of operates independent. Okay, so you're gonna call that, I've seen facilities that call that stage a separate player. Yeah, it's an LP player, that it's always going to meet the 400 feet per second requirement. They will operate that at 270 because it won't exceed 400. If you're going to exceed 400 and not be reporting a deviation or exceed its own standard, then you're stay at 270. But if you want to say, well, it pressures up with the rest of them, and we'll go sonic, now you have to be 800 all the time because they don't allow, or at least nobody's gotten the approval to move between ranges. Even though when you look at the regulations, 270 is okay for all these flares that are low pressure BTU gas flares. They're suddenly, if you're going to exceed that, if you're at 800, you're okay. Why could you not move between, or why could you not move between them? They set their life. 270 is good, 800 is good. Why can't you move between them? And they basically, the answer was, you would have to provide data showing that you meet all these requirements and moving through this is before they would be willing to give a response. But they basically said, we're not approving that, and we can't give you 100% definitive answer because we need a lot more information. So if somebody wants that, I mean, that would be a great thing for someone to go and get approval for that, because that would open that up for everybody. And that would save a ton of natural gas.
But I mean, there's also a design concern. Your design for your low BTU gas with the 16 stage, you're over drilling reports. So if you go sonic, you're playing dead. So
Yeah, I don't think that's the general design, right? Because that 800 kilo shut it down. Basically, what I gave you, I think the design is 17. But he just not coming, close that off.
Close it off, or, I mean, some people, and we talked about this too, some people put back pressure regulating control valve on there. So that it limits it, so that it, again, only has that 400 feet per second max, plus.
Small, that's what they have.
Okay, the low pressure station on the end of the field or,
We put it in the very good,
where
because it's always on, whenever it's always on. But the fire goes far away, it's just, stick it right. That's our design.
Yeah,
It's just not a,
yeah, no, that's what I'm saying, because I've seen a bunch of them where that low pressure station is like on the end. It's like, but if you see the height, you would want it maybe in the middle.
and I've seen that design as well, but these, all plants like what she kind of, because.
no, I mean, typically, well, they can't, I mean, it's on the wind, right, because they can't do low pressure fires that are very effective on that. But yeah, I mean, your 400 feet per second may not be your limitation. Your fence height might be your limitation on it's.
I just spent some on.
Yeah, yeah, no, they'll be,
You've already had. Already had.
yeah, but if you think about your burner's already, say, 10 foot off the ground, right? And so, you may think you've got a 50 foot, 60 foot tall fence, let's say 10 foot off that. You can get a 50 foot lane from 300 feet a second. So as a vendor, that's what we look at, right? We make sure we don't exceed 400, right? But typically, we're limiting ourselves to our fence height.
You know, when you say 400, that's not velocity.
Velocity through each tip. Usually it's below 10 rounds. And it's zero. Yes. I mean, normally coming through, you're looking at 2 to 3 pounds. As the system pressures up, you know, we'll regulate the pressure to that system to below 10 pounds. You know, sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 8. Again, it depends on what you're burning and then what that expected on is.
All right, last but not least, the only other thing that they added when they added the event on. One of the things that came about in the RSR was the mass specs were not specifically listed in the RSR for use. So the vendors got together and they asked for an amp. They got a broadly applicable amp, so anybody can use it, which brought in the used mass spec. And then the NHG calibration. So instead of having to do your dailies, quarterlies on the individual compounds and pass on your individual compound, because the compliance point is NHG, you can just pass on your accuracy on any total NHG of water. So that was brought into this rule instead of having to rely on a broadly applicable name. Just added some changes there. And PS9, I think everybody knows it. My pilots, we had most questions on PS9. Well, beyond all questions, PS9 is a big problem. But it's just causes a lot of confusion, especially just picking your concentrations. Because, you know, the PS9 was written for a NOx SEM, you're expected to be a PCM, and they're like, oh, do this to 100, your high value should be 140 to 160% of your max value. And it's like, okay, that's only a few ppm. When you're looking at air composition, your compositions can go, you know, any compound can get almost up to 100%. So now it's like, where am I setting these compositions? So it takes a little bit more thinking, a lot of thinking about dew points of these compounds in the cylinders.
And so just that might take a little extra time when you're doing, setting up your bottles.
What is this?
It's a performance spec for GC, basically. They're applying it to, it's the quality assurance, which you have to do before a GC, and they apply that to a mass spec. So it's initial multi-point calibration, 3 different concentrations in triplicate. Then you do a 7-day drift test for 7 days. You have a performance audit gas that you also have to do once during that period. Then you go to a daily mid. So the mid bottle has to be injected just once every day. And then quarterly, you go back to the multi-point calibration and the performance audit evaluation every quarter. So that's, and those gases can be injected at different locations. The only gas that has to go to the probe and back is the performance audit gas. All the daily, the quarterly multi-points, those can all be directed directly into the analyzer. So I can save a ton of gas instead of having to go all down there. So it's, but we see, people set them up and they're like, oh, I have to have the tubing to go to the probing bag from that one gas quarterly, and also you find a site that's sending all their gases through. And they're just like, and you're like, doing your 7-day calibration, and they're like, we can't do that with a single bottle. I'm like, no, you can't. You don't need to. And they're like, once they figure out that and comfortable that they can go straight to the analyzer, they're like, oh yeah, one bottle. Can do that, no problem. So it's getting everybody on the same page as what has to happen when, and where does it have to go. It's just something to work out and get right, because it don't just otherwise it doesn't happen. And on that NHV calibration check, you can't just say, oh, I'll get a methane bottle and I'll get a propane bottle and check my NHV at 2 different concentrations. You have to have your low, mid, and high bottles using the same pre-survey analysis that you did for the GC or the mass spec. So you have to have all those compounds in that bottle. So you don't think that you just short circuit that thing. You're still going to have a interesting mix of gases for that and trying to comply with the NHV option.
And usually, since you're still having those 3 blends, the BTU value is not set up in a linear fashion. It's actually usually pretty consistent across the 3 bottles.
Yeah, you can mix and match compounds. Well, for NHV, can you mix and match? Yeah, so that was the one thing with the low, mid, and high bottles, because these concentrations have to span such large ranges. We figured out how to play a little game where we would take a high concentration from the high bottle, we put it into the low bottle, that the corresponding low into the high, so we could fit everything in 3 bottles. We started doing a little mixeroo game so we wouldn't have to have 6 bottles with all the storage requirements for that. So we can play some fun games with getting your bottles in. But again, we found problems where all of a sudden it's like you're mixing compounds, but they said this is my low bottle, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, that's your low bottle, but it has the high for this compound in it, and suddenly you're not passing, and they're like, why am I not passing? And you're like, that's because you're not. They didn't say that compound is the high, not the low. And once they get all that worked out, so it's just again, you're doing everybody